Chapter 804, Archaeological Team. As he sighed, Klein indulged himself by relaxing like an ordinary person enjoying a rare instance of serenity and comfort in his dream. After about 15 minutes, he finally waited to the point when the church's beyonder that was sent to placate him had left. Finally, I can sleep in peace. Klein planned on opening his eyes out of habit before falling asleep again, but he realized that once he wasn't on high alert and on guard, the remnant sense of tranquility in his dream would allow him to directly fall into a deep slumber. That night, the quality of his sleep was extremely good, and he only managed to wake up at daybreak. Outside, the sun had just peeked out over the horizon, while the moon remained shining in the sky, and there was a slight howl from the winds. Klein lazily dazed in bed for nearly 10 minutes before picking up the golden pocket watch by his bedside table and snapping it open. It's not even 6:30. Should I roll over and continue sleeping, or should I wake up? Klein observed his physical condition and found his mind clear and brimming with energy. He didn't have any hint of feeling lethargic, so he decided to get out of bed to wash up before walking to his balcony to take a look at the orange vista. In this season, due to the wind, Backlund didn't have thick smog. Together with the environmental measures put into place over the past few months, the skies were often blue and the air fresh. The gardeners were already busy in the garden, and the parlor maid and handymen were heading to the market. Other than them, the surroundings were calm and peaceful. This invigorated Klein as he temporarily forgot all his troubles. He felt that the world belonged to him at that moment. With a faint smile, he silently enjoyed the scenery. In the next 15 minutes, servants would walk out from the surrounding houses in pairs or threes. They were either holding baskets or leading horses. The entire borough seemed to come to life as the sunlight grew brighter. This is what life should be like. Klein silently sighed as he had the sudden urge to take a stroll. He turned around and left the balcony and walked to the door. Outside the master bedroom, Richardson was already waiting outside. It was impossible to guess what time he had woken up. This was the most difficult thing about a valet. He needed to sleep later than his employer but also wake up earlier than him. There's another hour before breakfast. Sir, if you wish for it to be brought forward, the kitchen will be ready within 15 minutes. Richardson didn't ask Dwayne Dantes why he had suddenly woken up so early. Klein chortled and said, "There's no need to bring it forward. I plan on taking a stroll first." "Very well, sir." Richardson entered the bedroom, and based on his employer's suggestion, he chose a coat and helped him wear it. Finally, Klein wore a silk top hat and held a gold-inlaid cane before walking down to the first floor. Leaving the residence, he strolled down the street that was lined with Intis parasol trees and black street lamps until he reached the other end. Along the way, each residence's garden emanated a faint fragrance as the green leaves of the trees created a sense of tranquility from high above. Pedestrians were in pairs or threes in what seemed like a sparse street. The occasional carriage that drove by would break the silence before quickly leaving. Klein enjoyed the morning, taking in the pleasantness of waking up early. He felt that the negative emotions from yesterday were evaporating bit by bit and vanishing. Beyonders need to learn how to create conditions for themselves to regulate their moods. By taking this stroll, the bishops at St. Samuel Cathedral will likely know that Dwayne Dantes has completely recovered. They won't disturb my sleep in the middle of the night. As Klein's thoughts wandered, his gaze swept past 39 Backlund Street. It was Member of Parliament Macht's residence. Its external perimeter was in the form of sharp iron rods, allowing passers-by to appreciate the beauty of the garden within through the gaps. While moving his gaze away, Klein saw a familiar figure. It was Hazel with her long black-green hair and dark brown eyes. This beautiful and proud lady was strolling through the garden's trails with her maid, looking around from time to time. She woke up early as well. Her quality of sleep is excellent because she doesn't need to head down the sewers in the middle of the night. Klein lampooned and retracted his gaze as he continued proceeding forward. Glancing at Richardson, who was silently following behind him, Klein suddenly thought of the news reports, magazine articles, and novels he had recently read about the southern continent. He consciously kept up with the content of that region because that would flesh out his persona as Dwayne Dantes. After all, a lot of what he knew about the southern continent stemmed from the pirates, adventurers, and the Fog Sea's strongest hunter, Anderson. He had no idea if they were exaggerated or fabricated. The information I've read recently and in the past were about people who struck it rich in the southern continent before returning or had just decided to stay there. This makes Backland residents believe that there's gold everywhere in the southern continent, and that there are opportunities to strike it rich. Even common wood and sap can be used for many things, allowing one to exchange for plenty of pounds. That's why the kingdom frequently goes to war with countries like Fasak and Intis to vie for the colonial lands. If not for the commoners' inability to save up for the ferry tickets or dare to smuggle themselves there, I'm sure a large number of people would swarm it. As Klein's thoughts whirred, he casually asked his valet, "What's your impression of the southern continent?" He remembered that Richardson was born in a manor over there. He had only been brought to Backland when he was an adult. Richardson paused for a few seconds and said, "Sir, I actually do not know much about the southern continent because I was spending most of my time in the manor. I had few opportunities to head out. Just tell me of your impressions, your true impressions. You don't have to hold back. I just want to have a general understanding. As you know, they all believe me to be an expert of the southern continent, but in fact, my experiences are only limited to a few places and merchants," Klein said with a chuckle. Richardson nodded and bowed his head as he looked at his toes that were walking forward. "My impression of the southern continent is hunger, exhaustion, pain, as well as pining for the world after death. Hunger, exhaustion, pain." Klein repeated those 3 words as he walked into Buckland Street without making any further inquiry. East Chester County, in a building beside Stone University. Audrey was looking at the collections obtained by the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. She had originally planned on coming on Tuesday afternoon, but Associate Professor Michelle Duth had participated in an academic conference in Backland, therefore only returning today. As a result, she had no choice but to change her plans. This pair of boots was discovered by a farmer in a mountainous ruins in Stone. Its shape and traits matched the societal trends of the Fourth Epoch. Michelle introduced the item inside the glass cabinet to the beautiful aristocrat. Audrey looked over with interest and discovered that the ends of the boots were curled like a clown's. The heights of the curled parts weren't uniform. One was 3 centimeters, and the other was 5 centimeters. They didn't look like a pair. The Fourth Epoch's asymmetrical style. I wonder what level it is for 3 on the left and 5 on the right. Audrey retracted her gaze and followed Associate Professor Michelle to the next exhibit. At the end of the tour, Michelle pointed at the glass case diagonally ahead of them and said, "This coat of arms was delivered a few days ago. It involves the very ancient worship of dragons." Dragons. Audrey strode forward in a reserved manner and saw a grayish-white dragon with its wings spread out engraved on the coat of arms. "Where does it come from?" Audrey asked just as she did before. Michelle answered, "It's from a village named Heartlark. This Loanese word doesn't have an archetype in ancient Fasak. Apparently, it was written like how it's read. Heartlark. That's the village which I previously visited that had the folk tradition of worshipping dragons. In the sea of collective subconscious of the people there, there's a mine dragon in it. The 20-year war notebook which I previously obtained from Associate Professor Michelle was from a local knight named Lindalira. He was suspected to have something to do with that mine dragon." Audrey nodded in thought as she deliberated over her words, wishing to ask about the person who had found the coat of arms. At that moment, Associate Professor Michelle's expression turned abnormally heavy. Accompanying the discovery of this coat of arms was a tragedy. A tragedy? Audrey didn't hide her surprise. Associate Professor Michelle sighed and said, an archaeological team entered the village to study the folk tradition of worshipping dragons, but that night, one of the members went mad. And this mental illness was apparently contagious. The entire archaeological team later went mad, killing themselves or each other. In the end, none of them survived. This coat of arms was found among their remains. It was first taken away by the police, and after confirming that it's without problems, only then did they donate it to us. An archaeological team entered the village, and the members went mad one after another. Audrey's eyes dilated as she inwardly repeated Associate Professor Michel's words. Suddenly, an idea came to mind. Psychology alchemists. The members of the archaeological team were members of the psychology alchemists. Chapter 805, Meeting up inside the building of the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. Audrey, whose thoughts were undergoing an upheaval, blinked. She took note of her body language and expressions as she drew a crimson moon on her chest in a half-genuine manner. She said with a sigh, "What a tragedy. I hope that their spirits can rest in peace." The reason she had guessed that the archaeological team had comprised of members of the psychology alchemists was that she had previously received a mission to help the organization obtain a notebook related to the 20-year war from Associate Professor Michel. And this notebook belonged to the knight from Heartlark Village, Lindalira. Back then, Audrey had made a request to Mr. Fool and relied on magic mirror divination to determine the origins of the notebook. She discovered that it was deeply connected to the village that worshipped dragons. As she knew ahead of time that there was a mind dragon hiding within the sea of collective subconscious, she ultimately chose to hand over the notebook to the psychology alchemists in consideration of her lacking sequence and strength. That also meant that the psychology alchemists had quite a significant chance of locking onto Heartlark Village through the notebook before heading over to find their target. Another factor that Audrey used in her judgment was the strange mental illness that the archaeological team suffered. It had spread like a plague, causing the people to go mad in batches. In the real world, there was a probability that mental illnesses were hereditary, but it was almost impossible to be contagious. But in the mysterious world, in the world of the mind and consciousness, chaos and madness could be spread to others through spirit channeling, dreams, and the subconscious. And hidden in Heartlark Village was a mind dragon that had lived for years. The psychology alchemists had found Heartlark Village through the notebook, and the threatened mind dragon used this ingenious method to spread mental corruption. He might have achieved this through the sea of collective subconscious. The Beyonder world sure is dangerous. This small team must have been formed by a selection of Beyonders, but they ended their lives in such a simple and ridiculous manner. As Audrey thought about it, she was glad that she had made a sufficiently rational decision. She hadn't willfully used the knight's notebook to explore Heartlark Village. Otherwise, there would probably have been an addition named to the list of members who went mad. Thanks to Mr. Fool. Thanks to the other members of the Tarot Club. Thanks to Kalangos who previously infiltrated in disguise. They allowed me to still recognize the hidden dangers despite my lack of actual experience in the domain of mysticism. It made me sufficiently cautious. Audrey silently thought in gratitude. At that moment, her recalling her performance when she first joined the Tarot Club had made her wish to bury her head in her pillows to roar at herself, "Audrey, you were that naive and immature back then. Thankfully, you met Mr. Fool. If it were any other secret existence, you would have long gone mad or turned into a monster. Mr. Fool is such a nice man. No, such a nice orthodox god." By the side, Associate Professor Michel noticed that Audrey had been silent. He said with a heavy nod, "Yes, it truly is a tragedy that strikes one with fear. I only wish that the government has already handled the matter and prevented the contagious mental illness from becoming a plague. Don't worry, unless that mind dragon loses control and plans to challenge the three churches, there won't be any more victims of that mental illness." Audrey replied silently. From her point of view, the official Beyonders had already taken on the case. After all, a contagious mental illness was definitely going to be under the purview of the official Beyonders. Therefore, the dragon coat of arms in the glass case must have been determined to be fine before being donated to the Foundation. The police department didn't have such authority. While Audrey felt pity for the archaeological team who were suspected to be Psychology Alchemists members, as though she had experienced the tragedy for herself, she was curious if the Mind Dragon remained in the vicinity of Heartlark Village. To hide in the sea of collective subconscious with one's actual body would probably make it difficult to be discovered. However, the three churches have a long history. In the fourth epoch or even earlier, they must have had bouts with mind dragons, so perhaps they have the corresponding records about it. Besides, the Psychology Alchemists is in control of the spectator pathway and has the existence of high-sequence Beyonders. Their comprehension of the sea of collective subconscious can't be much weaker than the mind dragons. After suffering a terrible failure due to the lack of information, they will definitely send a very powerful team. Although that mind dragon was stronger than what the Psychology Alchemists expected, it probably wouldn't stay there to be discovered. It should have left. Audrey made an inference based on what she knew. She didn't have any thoughts of visiting Heartlark Village to figure out the truth, because she long knew that the present her lacked the strength to deal with the mind dragon. Her only intentions were to mention the matter at the next Tarot Club, and see if the other members could provide any feedback or any valuable knowledge. For example, it might be that the mind dragon had entered the sea of collective subconscious because of the local worship of dragons, or it could be that the mind dragon's inhabitation of the sea of collective subconscious caused the villagers to dream of it, thus, being subconsciously influenced and having the tradition of worshipping the dragon. On Friday afternoon, Klein received the invitation list for the ball tomorrow. He began to seriously memorize the topics he needed to discuss with different guests. When meeting Member of Parliament mocked, I need to make remarks about the recent good air in Backland, and make a few jokes about the Lone Kingdom Imperial Science Institute. As Klein memorized each line, he suddenly heard stacked illusory pleas. A man. Based on how long it's been, it's most likely Mr. Hanged Man. In thought, Klein put down the piece of paper in his hand and gulped down a mouthful of black tea before leaving the half-open room with the big balcony to head for the master bedroom's bathroom. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog, and he discovered that it was indeed the Hanged Man. This man had requested the Honorable Fool to inform the world that he had arrived at the capital of the Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Biome. He could head for the primitive island in 2 days after he replenished his supplies. He wanted the world to begin preparations so that they could meet in time. He also indicated that if he lacked the means to head for the primitive, he could arrange for the world to secretly board the Blue Avenger. Board the Blue Avenger and bring a bunch of sailors from the Church of Storms to the vicinity of the primitive island? How long can the Sanguine's anesthetic gas you bought from Emlyn last? Will there be enough time to explore? Klein thought for a moment and conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow, making him pray devoutly, "There's no need to go through that much trouble. You should have freedom of movement in Biome. Meet at the cemetery outside the city at midnight today. Before that, replenish your stores. Biome, in an inn." Alger frowned slightly after hearing the world Gehrman Sparrow's words. He did have freedom of movement in the City of Generosity. This was because the sailors were eager to head to places like the Red Theater. They were definitely not returning tonight, and after waking up in the day, it was almost certain that they would head to a casino to gamble to let themselves loose. It was to vent the repression and misery that resulted from drifting out at sea for extended periods of time. That also meant that even if Alger disappeared for a night and a day, no one would discover it. Is the world implying that we use this interval? That is indeed better than using the Sanguine's anesthetic gas. I've already used it twice, so who knows if someone is already suspicious about it and is waiting for his theory to be validated. But without a ship, how do we head for the primitive island? Oh, Laymanos Travels? Miss Magician did mention that it has the beyonder power of teleportation. However, there's only one page, making it impossible for a return trip. Alger relied on his strong ability to connect matters to vaguely guess at Gehrman Sparrow's intent, but he believed that the necessary conditions were lacking. With these doubts in mind, he found his contact with the resistance and replenished his storm charms that were made with tin. When it was 11 at night, Alger secretly left his inn and headed out of the city under the shadows. He wasn't worried that the sailors would discover his disappearance because he too had physical needs. It was possible that he was sleeping in a lady's bed in the Red Theatre and was unwilling to return. And there were many such brothels in Byam, with many prostitutes in existence. It was impossible to say that there was something wrong with him because he wasn't at the Red Theatre. Once he left Byam, Alger walked on a narrow road where horse carriages couldn't pass as he headed for the mountainside of the mountain range beside the sea. Suddenly, his gaze froze as he noticed something. Under the crimson moonlight's illumination, the mountain that originally existed had vanished. And the area underneath, such as the piled stones, vegetation, and terrain, changed almost completely. This Alger had come from the Resistance's private harbor earlier. He hadn't managed to pay close attention to the mountain, hence, he only noticed the abnormality at that moment. The mountain collapsed? It actually collapsed? Right, it was previously mentioned in the papers that Byam encountered a shallow earthquake, with its might being focused in the mountain range outside the city. Also, the church's deacon said that Gehrman Sparrow nearly destroyed Byam, and that matter had demigods involved. Both of them occurred during the same period. Could it be caused by Gehrman Sparrow? He instigated a demigod-level battle, and he managed to successfully escape while killing Admiral of Blood? Alger's pupils dilated as his footsteps slowed down to a halt. He suddenly understood why the Church of Storms had placed great importance on Gehrman Sparrow, and why he had a bounty worth as much as £50,000. In the undamaged cemetery up ahead, a cold wind blew across it and towards Alger in the silent night. It made him tremble involuntarily. At that moment, Alger's heart stirred as he turned his head to look right. Underneath a giant tree, a figure quickly outlined itself in the shade. This figure had his hand on his top hat while he slowly looked up, revealing a thin face and cut features. The emotionless dark brown eyes were none other than Gehrman Sparrow's. Chapter 806, Entering the island in the middle of the night. He did teleport over. How extravagant. Alger tensed up before relaxing, however, he did not let his guard down at all. Upon meeting Gehrman Sparrow again, he discovered that there wasn't much of a change to him. However, his every action had the indescribable air of a powerhouse, and the profundity he exuded left him apprehensive. As expected of the crazy adventurer who can instigate a battle of demigod proportions while escaping unscathed. The slight bit of smugness of having become a Sequence 5 vanished from Alger. He slowly walked over with lantern in hand. When he saw Gehrman Sparrow, he deliberately probed, the traces you left behind might not vanish for the next few centuries or even millennia. He was trying to confirm if the mountain's collapse had anything to do with Gehrman Sparrow. Klein shot a glance at the modified terrain as he released his grip on his top hat and smiled in a gentlemanly manner. The one who contributed the most in causing this damage was Sea King. Man, he actually triggered a demigod battle that could have destroyed Byam, causing Sea King to directly attack. Yet, despite such circumstances, he survived and left with Admiral of Blood. It's completely unimaginable and unbelievable. Alger began to suspect if Gehrman Sparrow had a Grade 1 sealed artifact on him, an item at the demigod level. He didn't express his shock and surprise, nor did he dare to probe further. Instead, he asked, "Do you plan on heading to that primitive island now?" "Of course," Klein answered calmly. It was late at night, a period when Dwayne Dantes was asleep. No one would disturb him, but he had to show himself once it was daytime. Of course, to prevent any unexpected circumstances, Klein had summoned a Rhodes to monitor the mirror illusion and provide a response. It's thanks to the Church of Evernight for having ended its dream treatment of Mr. Tycoon, otherwise, I would definitely have to delay the operation. Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Alger observed himself and discovered that he wasn't able to obtain any mystical item in such a short span of time. He then took out an iron black ring that protruded out like a thorn and wore it on his left thumb. Bearing with the excruciating headache, he nodded slightly. I hope for a pleasant partnership. Then, he saw Gehrman Sparrow walk over with a stoic expression, reach out his hand, and grab his shoulder. At that instant, Alger's first reaction was that Gehrman Sparrow was attacking him. He instinctively wanted to turn to the side to dodge his attack, only to recall his previous guess. Amidst his racing thoughts, he withheld his subconscious reaction and allowed the crazy adventurer to place his palm on his left shoulder. Right on the heels of that, he noticed Gehrman Sparrow's left hand turn transparent as though it was bearing the shadows of the spirit world. Then, the blacks before his eyes grew darker, and the crimson moon turned brighter. All kinds of colors seemed to layer upon one another. Countless nearly formless figures receded backwards as Alger tore through the spirit world with Gehrman Sparrow's help. Creeping hunger. Teleport. So that's how it is. Just as he had such a thought surface in his mind, he saw his body plummet as the saturated colors around him receded. Everything had returned to normal. Beach, reefs, trees. This is a deserted island. Alger surveyed the area and was just about to speak when the colors around him saturated as the layered phenomenon happened once again. This time, when he left the spirit world, he was in midair with undulating waves beneath him. Although Alger had never worked with Gehrman Sparrow in actual combat before, the experience him immediately created a spiraling wind and allowed them to float. It was a tacit display of teamwork. Hence, the teleportation triggered successfully once again as Alger's and Gehrman Sparrow's figures rapidly phased away. When the surroundings were restored again, the two had arrived at the periphery of a gigantic island. There was a heavy mist in midair that the crimson moonlight was unable to fully penetrate. This not only failed to disperse the darkness in the forest and mountain, but it also added an eerie charm to it. "We're here," Alger said as he looked around. Klein wore an indifferent expression, but in fact, he was cautiously observing his surroundings. He found the place extremely quiet. There weren't any birds tweeting, wolves howling, or bugs chirping. It exuded a deathly silence. As though guessing his feelings, Alger raised the lantern and illuminated the shrubs ahead where there was a natural trail made up of beast-type footprints. He said, "If you come in the day, it will be quite a lively sight. You will even see birds that only exists in myths fly in the forest. But at night, the power that rules this place will change. Many beyonder creatures will hide as they await daybreak. Mr. Hanged Man has come here more than once. At the very least, he has the experience of a day and night here." Klein silently nodded without speaking further. Alger thought for 2 seconds and pointed ahead. "If we follow this trail and enter the dark forest all the way to the end, we will arrive at that ancient ruins of unknown age. On the way, we can hunt the beyonder creatures that we encounter and are able to deal with. If it's killed independently, the corresponding ingredients will belong to the killer. Those we jointly killed will be held in your custody. When we leave this place, we can take turns to choose. We will determine the owner based on our contribution, to decide who has the priority to choose, as well as the number of priority choices." Instead of being in a rush to take action, he first made clear the route and the plan to split the loot. It was to prevent any conflict that would result from the exploration. "To let me have custody of the loot we receive from a joint kill. Mr. Hanged Man is being very sincere." Klein raised his right hand and pressed down his half-top hat and chuckled. "No problem." Alger heaved a sigh of relief and continued, "Our main goal is to explore that ancient ruins. The spoils we obtain along the way are supplementary. Once we finish the exploration, it's best we leave immediately without heading to the other zones or taking other paths. As for anything in the future, it's up to you to decide when and where you would like to explore. Alger emphasized this matter because he was afraid of Gehrman Sparrow's greed. After all, Beyonders were not perpetual machines. There was bound to be a point when they were exhausted. After a round of explorations, they were bound to be close to their limits. If they were to force themselves to hunt Beyonder creatures in other zones, perhaps the identities of hunter and prey would switch. Even if the crazy adventurer was very powerful and unafraid of such danger, to be in a state of drained spirituality would trigger signs of losing control. Do you think I'm not sharing the same thoughts as you? I'm the one worried that you'd be the one who's overly greedy, rashly proceeding deeper just to obtain more. Klein smiled and said, I'm a polite person. Polite? Alger was a little puzzled by Gehrman Sparrow's choice of words. The corners of Klein's mouth curled as his expression turned darker in the darkness. When visiting someone's place for the first time, overstaying would be impolite. This fellow's train of thought and logical behavior is completely different from that of a normal person's. As expected of a crazy adventurer. Alger was first taken aback before he raised the lantern and took a step forward in the dim red shadows. Let's set off. Klein allowed his hands to naturally droop down as he walked beside Alger like he was on a hike. The two quickly entered the dark forest that had nearly zero moonlight shining in. They saw that the trees were thick and tall with luxuriant leaves. Even the smallest trees were thicker than the span of a person's arm. And the trait they all had in common was that the bark appeared scaly. They were densely packed together as though they would come to life or squirm at any moment. It's like a mutated Drago tree. A snake-scaled tree? Klein retracted his gaze and noticed the weeds at his feet that didn't seem problematic. None of them spoke as they maintained a state of abnormal silence. They didn't wish to say anything to eliminate the awkwardness just because it was too quiet. As they walked, the duo saw the distribution of trees ahead turn sparser thanks to the lantern's light. Thump. 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 A dull knocking sound echoed through the area. As Alger and Gehrman approached, it became clearer and more obvious. When the duo entered the sparse area, the lantern's light finally revealed hunched or prostrate figures. Amongst these figures were humans, baboons, goats, and tigers. They were either holding rocks or using their claws and teeth to constantly burnish the stacked trees and rocks as though they were building a palace. Without the obstruction from the luxuriant leaves, the crimson moonlight that penetrated the heavy mist cloaked these figures, dyeing them with a faint blood-red layer. There are humans? Klein's eyes focused as he immediately spread his left fingers. Alger slowed down, preparing his vocal cords to be activated at any moment. Suddenly, the figures seemed to sense something as they stopped their actions in unison before uniformly turning around to look at the two outsiders. They either had pale faces, withered skin, or festering bodies. None of them looked alive. Corpses. A Beyonder creature is driving these corpses to build a palace for it? Klein cast his gaze past them and saw a dark cave that led deep into the ground. The surroundings were covered in weeds as white feathers stained with yellow oil scattered among them. Feathers. Corpses. These instantly reminded Klein of the products of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project, as well as the infectious aura that made him grow feathers. This zone's sovereign won't be weak. He calmly made a judgment. At that moment, Alger, who had carefully observed for a while, hesitated for 2 seconds before suggesting, I've never seen such a situation before. I'm not sure of the level of the Beyonder creature. Why don't we circle around it and choose a target which we have more confidence in? His instincts told him that something extremely dangerous was hiding in the dark underground cave. I was waiting for you to say that. Maintaining his persona as Gehrman Sparrow, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he chuckled. Will this be impolite? Just as he said that, the land quaked as though a creature beneath them was rolling over in its bed. Chapter 807, Mediocre Luck. Sensing the land quake, Alger's heart tightened as he glanced at Gehrman Sparrow, using his actions to replace his words. The sound of wind howled beside him, allowing him to run more easily and quickly to the side. The reason why Alger had done so was because he was worried that Gehrman Sparrow would suddenly go mad and decide to hunt the terrifying creature inside the dark underground cave. If that were to happen, even if they ultimately clinched a victory, it would have been extremely disadvantageous for the subsequent explorations. As an experienced sailor, he knew that decisive action spurred companions who remained indecisive into subconsciously following his actions. Upon seeing this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he gave up the discussion about politeness. He widened his stride and ran behind the hanged man. Following that, he sensed a strong wind blow at his feet, thrusting him forward. This significantly reduced his need to overcome gravity, allowing him to obtain additional mobility that instantly doubled his speed. Amidst the rustling sounds, Klein and Alger ran out of the sparse woods and circled around the flank of the eerie darkness. At this moment, their heartbeats suddenly slowed. It was as though they hadn't been engaging in intense exercise and were instead in a state of reverie that resulted from the tanning of the afternoon sun. Klein immediately felt his body turn cold as an inexplicable and baffling sense of gloom arose as they tried invading his body. Meanwhile, he saw the light from Alger's lantern be swallowed inch by a gigantic black shadow. A corresponding scene naturally surfaced in his mind. In the depths of the dark underground cave, a thick, humongous serpent snaked out. It had dark green scales with exaggerated eyes that seemed to burn with fire. In between its scales were white feather covered in yellow oily stains. Along its back was a pair of thick wings that could be spread. While slithering and flying, this giant serpent raised its body high, coiling itself around a thick tree and extending its pitch-black tongue. It stared intently at the two figures that had barged into the surrounding area. Around it, the trees were rapidly withering along with the weeds. Countless corpses burrowed out of the soil as invisible shadows surged to its side. Feathered serpent. It was a feathered serpent. In the southern continent, it was a symbol of holiness. It was the emblem of the descendants of death, the Eggers family. Klein and Alger didn't pause as they held back the coldness of their bodies and their slowing heartbeats. Under the intense winds, they charged into the depths of the dark forest, pulling a distance away from the sparse trees. Ba-dump. 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 The duo's heartbeats gradually returned to normal as the coldness of their bodies were dispersed by the heat generated from the intense exercise. Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the danger had passed. Hence, he slowed down his pace and turned to glance back. He said calmly while facing the depth of the darkness, "A demigod-level feathered serpent." Demigod level, Alger similarly slowed down as the blood vessel in his forehead pulsed. He paused for 2 seconds and exhaled lightly. "Don't worry about it. The Beyonder creatures here are very territorial. Unless they wish to hunt, they will not enter other zones, especially when it's near the mountain. That feathered serpent wouldn't chase after us." Klein nodded and said, "The Beyonder creatures here are very strong." Alger retracted his gaze and replied with a shake of his head. "No, there are also many weak ones. I've been here at night before, but I've only discovered the traces left behind by Beyonder creatures at the demigod level without encountering them. I actually encountered one this time. Such matters are mainly about luck. The chances of this happening again isn't too high. As a seafarer, being able to calculate was a necessary ability. Are you looking down on me, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck?" Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he said with a deadpan expression, "Absolute judgments often result in the opposite results." When translated into Earth speak, it was, "Don't raise death flags." In fact, if it wasn't a feathered serpent at the demigod level, and instead was something at sequence 5, Klein would be happy to bully it. After all, with Azek's copper whistle in hand, the Beyonder creatures in the death domain would lose at least half their combat strength. As for encountering a beyonder creature at the demigod level, he wasn't too alarmed. This was because the Hanged Man had previously mentioned it, and he had made the corresponding preparations. He had the Fate Siphon Charm, 3 pages of demigod-level beyonder powers in Lamino's travels, and the ability to travel. Although it wasn't necessarily the case that he could resist a demigod, it was enough to help him create opportunities to escape. As long as I do not encounter angels. Klein silently added inwardly. After hearing Gehrman Sparrow, Alger was somewhat puzzled. This was because the crazy adventurer was clearly informing him to be more careful and cautious. A cold and crazy fellow? That's right. If he's just crazy, he wouldn't have lived to this day. Alger looked up at the sky as he tried hard to look past the mist and distinguish the blurry stars. After 2 minutes, he retracted his gaze and pointed in a direction. We'll head in that direction. Klein had long drawn his iron-black death knell. He allowed the muzzle to naturally point downward as he silently followed alongside Alger. He wore a cold and composed expression that had no signs of anxiety. After traversing the extremely dim forest for some time, Alger suddenly stopped. As he looked to his left, he said in a deep voice, "If we head forward more, there will be an illusory chime tree. I hope to handle it by myself. The second beyonder creature we encounter will be handled by you. I won't involve myself in the hunt. Unless you can't handle it alone." Alger swallowed the second half of his sentence. He wasn't like the hunters who were often seen at sea, people who often couldn't hold their tongues as they habitually said things that infuriated others. The main beyonder ingredient which Miss Justice needs. Mr. Hanged Man has quite a bit of adventuring experience under his belt. He knows that being frank at times is more useful than concealing matters, and that negotiating is more effective than scheming. Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's persona as he nodded with a hint of gentlemanliness amidst his coldness. Okay. If you can't deal with it, it's best you shout for help, otherwise, I'll treat it as your persistence. The style of a crazy adventurer appears to be different from hunters, but in certain aspects, they are surprisingly similar. Alger silently drew a breath as he continued forward with his lantern. As they walked, they heard weak chiming sounds, and they immediately felt as though they were home, their bodies and mind at ease. Klein acutely sensed that his wariness was melting away in an irreversible manner. No matter how much he emphasized it to himself, he was unable to tense up. At that instant, he even had the urge to head for the source of the chimes, believing that there was something extremely dear and familiar to him located over there. As they were quite a distance away, the chiming was sporadic. Klein was barely able to hold himself back as he turned to look at Mr. Hanged Man. Alger no longer looked as staid as before. The eyes of his rugged face were slightly red. It was unknown if he had recalled something that caused him to plunge into some emotional state. I wonder what Mr. Hanged Man looks like when he's crying. It must be quite terrifying. Klein couldn't help but muse. At this moment, Alger said softly with a hoarse voice, "Leave it to me." Just as he said that, he put down the lantern and slightly turned the sinister ring on his left thumb. He made the protruded thorn that looked like it was stained with old bloodstains turn brighter. This was his mystical item, Whip of Mind. Its side effects was to place the wearer in a state of a constant headache, one so bad that the wearer would yearn to slam their head into a wall. However, at that moment, the excruciating headache made Alger maintain his basic lucidity amidst the chimes without being truly hypnotized. At times, a side effect might actually provide benefits to the wearer. As Alger remained poignant, he took out a wooden box from his pocket and snapped it open. Inside it was a gray rat. Mr. Hanged Man wishes to use the rat as bait, so as to attract the illusory chime tree's attention before taking the opportunity to attack it? Not bad. He made adequate preparations. He already had a detailed plan ahead of time. As an experienced adventurer, Klein instantly guessed the Hanged Man's thought processes. Alger held up the rat and shook it when his expression suddenly turned odd. The grey rat was no longer moving. It wasn't breathing and was cold. It wasn't able to take on the responsibility of being bait. Back when they encountered the demigod-level feathered serpent, although Alger was in the periphery of the entity's focus and had escaped quickly without being overly affected, the grey rat he carried with him was only an ordinary animal. It didn't have a strong constitution and vitality, so it perished from the effects of the feathered serpent. It's dead. It's dead. Mr. Hanged Man now understands a principle: plans often can't keep up with change. His luck is mediocre. Upon seeing this scene, Klein couldn't help but twitch the corners of his mouth. He wanted to laugh, but he didn't make a sound, afraid that it would destroy his persona. Such situations were rare to the experienced and meticulous Hanged Man. Alger quickly reined in his emotions as he proceeded forward with the dead grey rat. Klein bent down and reached out for the lantern as he unhurriedly followed behind him. The chimes grew clearer as it made them more and more silent, with the urge to run towards it becoming greater. After taking another few steps forward, Klein finally saw that strange tree. Above its brownish-green trunk were thin cracks. Deep inside each crack was a darkness that looked as though different eyes were growing inside them. The branches that extended outwards had chime-like metal-gray objects hanging from them. They were swaying automatically, letting out melodious sounds. And on the branch closest to the trunk, there was a fist-sized, colorless, translucent fruit. Alger stared in that direction as he pressed at his throat before saying to Gehrman Sparrow with a heavy voice, "It's best you cover your ears and converge your spirituality." Chapter 808, Awful Singing. Upon hearing the Hanged Man, Klein's heart skipped a beat. He had an ominous premonition as he ignored his persona, put down the lantern, and took out 2 slips of paper. He then crumpled them into a ball and stuffed them into his ears. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow do it without any questions, Alger heaved a sigh of relief. He reflected on how nice it was to work with an experienced fellow. Even though he was an adventurer known to be crazy, he was someone who followed reasonable instructions. He knew what and what not to do. Just as he was about to throw the dead rat, which still retained some of its warmth, at the illusory chime tree to divert its attention, he suddenly saw the shrubs shake as a yellow-skinned, black-striped tiger appeared. Amidst the melodic chimes, the tiger walked towards the strange tree normally, but its eyes were glazed over. It felt indescribably creepy. When Alger saw this, he lowered his arm and abandoned his attempt of throwing the dead rat. Resisting the headache, he calmly watched as the tiger walked closer to the tree due to the growing influence of the melody. It crouched down, raised its right claw, and bared its claws, slicing itself at the neck. Despite the oozing blood, the tiger seemed to have lost all sense of pain. It continued digging in deeper, engorging the wound before it began to skin itself, revealing a naked body covered in mangled flesh and blood. The chimes gradually weakened as the branch suddenly came alive. It extended downwards, stabbing into the tiger's sorry, unprotected body. Alger, who was already prepared, immediately drew his dagger, opened his mouth, and sang hoarsely, "Break, break, break, on thy cold grey stones, O sea. Break, 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 at the foot of thy crags, O sea." His voice had bold overtones, but it was completely out of tune. It was at complete odds with the comprehension of both humans and creatures. It was a jarring boom that had a metallic sound to it. It was filled with the power that left one frustrated and disgusted. Meanwhile, the illusory chime tree's branches trembled as they retracted like they were huddling together. Following that, a melodious chime lessened the terrifying noise to a small extent. At Alger's side, although Klein had used paper balls to stuff his ears and had converged his spirituality, he immediately felt his forehead's blood vessels throb. He instantly had the urge to kill the singer and destroy everything before him. Furthermore, his mind had the feeling of being ripped apart. His muscles and vessels were squirming as a result. Others charge people money to sing, but Mr. Hanged Man's singing charges you with death." Klein lampooned as he resisted the irascibility in his heart. "Break! Break! Break!" Every word Alger said burst out like waves striking reefs. Bolts of silver lightning descended in turns, as though in euphoric praise. As silver flashes lit up one after another, they smote down at the illusory chime tree's surface, causing it to tremble incessantly. Its branches shook in a numb and random manner, making it difficult for it to produce the melodic hypnotic music. Alger took this opportunity as he threw the dead rat and thrust the dagger in his hand forward. With a howling wind, invisible blades swooshed over, slicing at the branch at the top and nearest to the illusory chime tree's trunk. Kacha! The colorless, palm-sized, translucent fruit fell as it was swept up by a gust of wind and flew into Alger's palm. The tree bark which was covered with eye-like cracks froze as the remaining branches drooped down, having lost their ability to move. Indeed, as long as you gather the correct intel ahead of time, beyonder vegetation at the same level is a lot easier to deal with than animals due to its lacking intelligence. Alger took out a golden container he had prepared, and he put away the illusory chime tree's fruit. Then, he turned around to look at Gehrman Sparrow. "Let's continue." He suddenly stopped speaking as the word "forward" vanished from his vocal cords. At that instant, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's cold expression looking somewhat warped. The whites around his brown irises were slightly red, as though he would unleash an attack upon him at any moment. Alger felt tense as he slowly drew a gasp and completed his sentence. "Let's continue forward." "Let's go," Gehrman Sparrow replied softly. He first circled around the withered illusory chime tree and walked deep into the dark forest. He didn't get any bark, branches, or materials that were rich in spirituality, because they were bound to encounter many beyonder creatures later. Furthermore, he didn't have any so-called storage artifacts. Naturally, he left whatever space he had for worthwhile spoils. Besides, having too many things on him would only weigh him down and prevent him from fully displaying the agility of a clown. Unfortunately, those are materials without any vitality or blood, making it impossible to enter Grosel's travels. I can let my marionette bring them in, but that will be very troublesome and detrimental to the subsequent exploration. As Klein sighed, he calmed his mind, extricating himself from the remnant effects of the Hanged Man's singing. This was the most jarring and terrible singing that he had heard in both his lives. If the Hanged Man continued for another 1 or 2 minutes, he couldn't guarantee that he could stop himself from beating him up. Using just paper balls to stuff my ears and converging my spirituality can only weaken the effects. There's no way to really block it out. Even a deaf person can hear it. This includes an exchange at the spirituality level. This is probably the most indefensible attack from an ocean songster. Furthermore, there's no way of dodging it once it happens. There's only lightning strike which can be dodged ahead of time. This is a rather powerful sequence 5 as well. However, why does Mr. Hanged Man's singing feel completely different from elvish songster Ciata's? As Klein summarized and analyzed his experience, he was somewhat puzzled. At this moment, the lantern-holding Alger, who was walking beside him, couldn't help but consider a question: even Gehrman Sparrow can't stand my singing. How should I act as an ocean songster? In that silent environment, the two quickly proceeded forward amidst thick trees that appeared to be covered in snakeskin as they approached the ancient ruins. With a seafarer beside him, Klein saved himself the trouble of using dowsing rod seeking. He focused on watching out for any sudden attacks. The dark and silent environment resembled a horror story. As the two proceeded forward for an unknown amount of time, they discovered that the trees were beginning to systematically become sparse. This was completely different from the situation back when they met the demigod-level feathered serpent. The trees there had abruptly become sparse, while what they were encountering now was a progressive change. It made them have the misconception that they were about to leave the dark forest. After passing through this zone, we will arrive at the periphery of the ancient ruins. Alger broke the silence. He paused and then added seemingly casually, based on my experience, it becomes more dangerous as we approach it. The signs of a demigod creature I found last time was around here. However, oddly, the periphery of the ancient ruins doesn't have any signs of beyonder creatures. However, I have no idea about deep inside it. This is probably because there's an even more terrifying existence inside the ancient ruins. That zone is its territory, so other creatures do not dare to approach. Klein mumbled inwardly. He had a sense for the danger level of this expedition. He had previously performed the corresponding divination above the grey fog, and the revelation he received was that it had its ups and downs, as well as its problems. However, leaving safely wasn't much of a problem. After the hanged man said that, Klein chuckled. You likely know what my guess is. He didn't say anything further as he entered the zone with sparse vegetation. Alger silently walked beside him, increasingly convinced about his judgment of Gehrman Sparrow. He was calm and crazy. After proceeding dozens of meters forward, they suddenly saw a pair of ghostly blue eyes situated at where the lantern's glow could reach. It was a black baboon crouched on a branch. Its fur was naturally curled, and its head grew black crystals. These crystals grew upwards in a random manner, forming a strange crown. Upon seeing the black baboon, Klein and Alger simultaneously had the urge to bow their heads to not look directly at it. They felt as though it was the ruler of the nearby region, their sovereign. Sovereign. Alger relied on the excruciating headache which the whip of mind brought him in order to escape its influence as he hurriedly took a step to the left in an attempt to avoid any direct clashes. He left the unknown beyonder creature to Gehrman Sparrow. They had agreed to it prior. However, despite walking to the left, he ended up walking forward. His legs also hobbled as though he suddenly needed crutches. Subconsciously, Alger drew his dagger, causing sharp wind blades to swish towards the curly-haired baboon. At that moment, the baboon grinned. The wind blades suddenly changed direction in midair, moving in every direction at random to perfectly avoid hitting the target. Upon seeing this scene, Klein gave up his plans on approaching through ordinary methods. His left glove instantly turned transparent as he turned invisible. Alger stopped his actions that resulted from his stress when he saw Gehrman Sparrow in his top hat appear behind the black curly-haired baboon. The distance between them was less than 5 meters. Right on the heels of that, the black curly-haired baboon's body abruptly stiffened as though it lost control of most of its body. It even tried hard to raise its palm, trying hard to dig at its eyes in an attempt to distort something. And at this moment, Gehrman Sparrow had already made use of this delay to raise the iron-black revolver in his right hand, aiming the dark barrel at its head. Then, without any emotion, the crazy adventurer pulled the trigger. Chapter 809, The Danger Amidst the Darkness. Bang. The loud gunshot reverberated in the sparse and open region as they extended outwards. If it was an ordinary island with an ordinary forest at night, it would have alarmed the birds and beasts, sending them scattering away. But here, everything remained quiet, so quiet that it didn't seem like any living creatures existed. As for that black curly-haired baboon, its head had burst open, splattering blood and brain matter everywhere like it was raining. The black crystal at its head shattered as well, with not a single piece remaining intact. Klein bent his arm and slowly retracted Death Knell, which was still spewing out smoke. He watched as the mutated curly-haired baboon's stocky body, one more that was muscular than a human's, collapsed to the group. By approaching with traveling, forcefully controlling with Wraith, and seizing the opportunity to deal a lethal strike with Death Knell, it was an instant kill. Klein wasn't doing this to flaunt his strength, but via his observations, he believed that the mutated curly-haired baboon had unique powers. If he didn't quickly finish it off while it didn't understand anything about him, there was a very high chance that the situation would be reversed, making the battle rather tricky. Besides, on such a dangerous primitive island, it was imperative he avoided situations from escalating, for no one knew what things could be lured by an intense battle. Therefore, after Klein possessed the mutated curly-haired baboon with a wraith, he gave up on the more reliable and more unnoticeable method of controlling spirit-body threads, because it took longer. Instead, he chose to cock the gun and use death knell to finish it off while it was stiff and slow as a result of the wraith's influence. The effects were identical to his expectations. The possible accidents that could happen midway were as he imagined. With the help of distortion and chaos, the mutated curly-haired baboon did possess the ability to extricate itself from the unfavorable situation of the wraith's possession, and it would allow the bullet's trajectory to violate the laws of physics and avoid its body. Unfortunately, its efforts had come to an abrupt stop before it could change any effects. Klein had seized that brief moment of sluggishness to decisively deliver the lethal strike. If he had switched to controlling spirit-body threads, the outcome might have been very different. It's worth it to suffer a weakness for this. Furthermore, there's a higher chance of me being needed to use death knell later. Compared to realizing what I'm afraid of in a more dangerous environment, it's better to know the problem ahead of time and avoid similar situations. That's the better option. Klein allowed his revolver to point downward as he walked to the side of the mutated curly-haired baboon. At this moment, under the wraith's control, the Beyonder characteristic of the Beyonder creature rapidly appeared. Alger held up the lantern as he watched this scene from a distance away. It took him nearly a minute to snap back to his senses. Frozen in his mind was ultimately the scene of the flare from Gehrman Sparrow's muzzle and the bursting head of the curly-haired baboon. The chaos they encountered in the beginning had made him understand that the Beyonder creature they had encountered was at a sequence higher than that of the illusory chime tree. It was a relatively difficult creature to deal with, one that required sufficient caution during combat. Furthermore, there wasn't any guarantee of victory. Yet, Gehrman Sparrow had finished the battle in 3 seconds. The speed at which it happened was as though he was engaging in target practice. Being a Sequence 5 Beyonder as well, the difference was unbelievable. Combining a short-distance teleportation ability and a strange power that can control an enemy for a certain amount of time, along with that astoundingly potent revolver, the effects are unimaginable terrifying. If I were to encounter it for the first time, I would definitely be killed instantly. And even if I'm prepared, it wouldn't be easy to resist it. The best solution is to use my singing to affect my surroundings indiscriminately. It will prevent Gehrman Sparrow from successfully completing a teleport. As expected of a crazy adventurer with a bounty of £50,000. Even without Mr. Fool's help, just him alone isn't weaker than Admiral Hell. It's possible that he's even stronger. While sighing poignantly, Alger reined in his thoughts as he considered how he could deal with the situation if he were in the curly-haired baboon's shoes. Compared to the descriptions from others and his own guesses, witnessing it himself was more convincing and shocking. Inside the corpse of the curly-haired baboon where the shattered black crystal was, a faint blob of light quickly appeared and converged together, turning into a translucent, pitch-black fist that was tightly clenched. Indifferently to their thoughts, the fist produced a feeling of strength and sinisterness. The palm's lines, luster, and fingernails seemed to follow ordinary principles, but they were filled with an abnormal charm. It seemed to hide large amounts of madness and chaos. Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion from the Black Emperor pathway? I wonder what weakness I received. I hope it's not too odd. I can use Death Knell as much as I want in the next 6 hours. As Klein muttered, he bent down to pick up the Beyonder characteristic and stored it in a prepared metal container. In fact, he could attempt to graze the curly-haired baboon and see if he could obtain the corresponding Beyonder powers of a Mentor of Confusion so as to swap away his gloves barren of corruption. But ultimately, he gave up on that idea since he wasn't sure what the Beyonder creature had done that made it deserve such torture. His encounter had been an encounter on a battlefield. Ensuring his enemy's death was nothing out of the ordinary, but grazing was an extremely excruciating pain that left a soul yearning for liberation. Klein had his own principles and stubbornness. He didn't easily violate them, and he often cautiously chose his targets. Of course, to him, creatures of lower intelligence were not the same as humans. Even if he attempted to graze it, it wasn't crossing the line. However, many of his past experiences told him that persisting to keep to his principles and not relax the requirements for himself was not only a moral question but was something to prevent himself from losing himself. He couldn't keep pushing the envelope just because he thought it was nothing. As the trivialities accumulated, it would eventually result in a terrible mistake. In this crazy and chaotic mysterious world, actions aren't for others to see, but for myself. A person can fool humans and even deities, but they can't fool themselves. I wonder if high-sequence beyonders from the spectator pathway can fool themselves. As Klein's thoughts raced, he took out Grozel's travels that he hid near his chest, intending to smear the curly-haired baboon's blood over its cover. At that moment, his heart tensed up as the hair along his neck stood up. This was an intense premonition of danger. And in this premonition, no scene had surfaced in Klein's mind. Not good. Klein instantly found his heart wrapped in layers of shadows as everything before his eyes seemed to be covered in a layer of dark glass. Without the luxury of time to consider what was happening, the glove on his left palm turned transparent once again. His figure turned invisible before he appeared beside Alger, reaching out to grab his shoulder. At that instant, Alger also sensed the abnormality. His heart contracted and expanded like the source of a storm as his blood surged through his veins and arteries like a tidal wave. Meanwhile, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's right hand which was grabbing his shoulder. From the fingernails, it was turning gray and turning dull, bit by bit, just like any stone that could be found anywhere in the dark forest. And his feet, knees, and muscles were turning stiff as though they no longer belonged to him. The two figures quickly turned transparent as they vanished from their location and entered a saturated and clearly overlapped spirit world as they quickly traversed it in the direction of the ancient ruins. Suddenly, the red, green, black, and other stacked colors before Klein's eyes uniformly darkened as they produced fine patterns that resembled raven black hair. Raven black hair. A chill rose up from their souls as Klein didn't hesitate to leave the spirit world with the hanged man and return to the real world where they landed in an area mixed with rubble and weed. Not far away was a mostly collapsed building. Through the corner of his eye, the hanged man had already turned grayish-white from the waist down, as though he had turned into a stone sculpture. "Pa!" Klein snapped his fingers, igniting the grass tens of meters away in preparation to leap over. At that moment, he suddenly felt his heart palpitate as his body began to tremble involuntarily. The appearance of the soaring flames was terrifying to him. The weakness death knell gave him this time, fear of fire. Seeing the dark glass thicken before his eyes, Klein felt a howling wind sweep him up from below before he could overcome the fear, causing him and Alger to fly up, passing through the invisible border and entering the vicinity of the ancient ruins. Bang! The duo fell to the ground simultaneously, producing the sound of crashing rocks. The thick shadow over their hearts vanished as the danger that hid in the darkness receded like the tide. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he saw the grayish-white color that had spread to his elbow turn faint and recede. He felt his physical condition was rapidly recovering after he left that zone. His back was covered in perspiration that soaked his shirt. And what left him most horrified was that he didn't know what monster had attacked him or what powers were used. Did Death Knell's gunshot alarm some monster in the vicinity, or is it the existence that rules over this forest at night? Thankfully, it doesn't dare to enter the vicinity of the ancient ruins. This isn't necessarily good. This means that deep in the ancient ruins is something that makes it fearful. I should be prepared to retreat at any moment. Klein stretched his hands and slowly stood up. At this moment, Alger escaped from that grayish-white layer as he turned his head to glance over. That zone was petrifying us. That zone. Petrification. Klein nodded in thought as he walked towards the mostly collapsed building that was strewn with weeds and covered in vines. He then replied in a deep tone, "The problem now lies ahead." Alger didn't speak further as he sped up his pace, steadily walking by his side. After approaching, Klein looked at the building. His gaze swept the spires and stone columns, as well as the damaged walls that remained standing. He stopped and asked seemingly casually, "What kind of building do you think this ruin was in the past?" Alger remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Cathedral." "A cathedral." Chapter 8:10, Whose Cathedral a Cathedral? We came to the same judgment. Klein looked at the ruin ahead of him as he silently muttered to himself. At that moment, the tiny amount of crimson moonlight that penetrated the mist had scattered onto the collapsed building. Compared to before, it was a lot richer in color, almost approaching the color of blood. Klein maintained German Sparrow's trademark cold attitude as he said in an unperturbed manner, "Where did you previously explore?" As he spoke, Klein glanced at the lantern in the hanged man's hand which remained unshattered despite all the ordeals. He subconsciously tensed up his muscles and skin when he saw the glow from the flame. Although the flame was ultimately contained by thick glass and metal frame, it still left him a little afraid. Alger didn't notice the minute changes in German Sparrow as he raised his dagger-wielding right hand and pointed at the grandest building amidst the ruin. There. All that was left of the building was its main structure. It was impossible to know what it originally looked like. The only things that could only be determined were that it had thick walls with narrow windows, and the building's scale and its magnificence. Furthermore, it once had a spire and clock tower. It had a Spartan facade and an ancient architecture. This is an architectural style from the early 4th epoch. There are records of these in the Church of Storm's canon. It's said that in that period, the various churches used such styles to build their cathedrals in a widespread fashion. Alger had a deep impression on the ruin. Over the years, he had flipped through many books and had acquired quite a bit of the background. Its greatest trait is the temple found above and the catacombs found below. Life and death were both unified here. However, I cannot confirm that the ancient cathedral's interior is as I described, as I've never ventured deep into it. This might be an architectural style left behind from the 3rd epoch. Klein made a guess as he walked straight to the opening of the ancient cathedral ruin's abnormally huge door. By keeping the lantern behind him, enjoying only the light emitted from it, he didn't need to suffer from his fear of fire. The duo quickly moved up the grayish-white stairs that were ridiculously high, and they arrived at the door's opening. Inside, they saw remnants of stone columns and arches that extended upwards towards the center. Klein wasn't in a rush to enter. He reached his left hand into his pocket and took out a gold coin as he allowed it to weave between his finger while seemingly muttering something. Suddenly, he flipped the gold coin and opened his palm to await its descent while saying to the hanged man, "How did you determine that deep in this cathedral is something of value that is not less than that of the cards of blasphemy?" After he said that, he looked at the gold coin that had fallen into his palm before putting it away. Alger pointed inside and said, "I've said before that my strength was inferior to Kalengo's, and I didn't go as deep as he did." I had no idea what he saw, other than the judgment that there was something extremely precious and important inside from his remarks. Furthermore, it was something that only a true Sequence 5 could obtain. However, the murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground might be able to explain something. Klein nodded and walked through the dark door's opening that the crimson moonlight was unable to illuminate. The black trench coat he wore fluttered gently behind him as Alger held up a lantern and clenched his dagger while following behind. Passing through the opening, Klein used the crimson moonlight that shone in from the opening at the dome to see the hall of considerable depth up ahead. A few of the ancient stone columns supporting it had already snapped. At the end wasn't an altar, nor were there any staircases that led upwards. It was completely dark and difficult to tell the details. It appeared as though it led underground. It isn't a temple above and a catacomb beneath. The temple is underground in the catacombs? It's impossible to determine that. We'll know only by venturing down. Klein subconsciously glanced around and discovered side doors along the two sides, but the regions they led to had already completely collapsed with no usable path. The murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground, he recalled what the hanged man had just said, and he took 2 diagonal steps before releasing the invisible wraith Seigneur. With his night vision, he began observing the remaining murals. The mural's background was of a towering and magnificent mountain. At its peak was a gigantic cross that was covered in a lustrous glow. In front of the cross were grand and abnormal figures that were clustered around. They were angels with 2 wings, 4 wings, or 6 wings. This. Klein did a cursory glance and felt a strong sense of familiarity. He had seen a similar mural before, back in Blasphemer Amon's mausoleum. When he focused again, Klein quickly noticed the difference. There weren't the 2 infants that represented Amon and Adam, nor were there any 12-winged angels. The grand figure in front of the cross held its arms to its chest as it held an ancient, Spartan slate. The slate was drawn in an extremely indistinct manner, yet, it felt both ancient and young, holy and sinister. It was an extreme contradiction. Slate. Klein's pupils dilated slightly as a specific term flashed in his mind, blasphemy slate. This is likely that ancient sun god, the Lord that created everything which the City of Silver worships. Indeed, the blasphemy slate is closely related to him. I wonder if this is the first blasphemy slate or the second. Klein roughly guessed at the cathedral's worshipped entity, and he also began to believe that the depths of the ruin hid items that were very valuable and important. He withdrew Seigneur's gaze and allowed the marionette to turn to face the ground. Apart from the slates being covered in cracks and some odd marks remaining, they were dark red in color, smaller than a human's forehead. They overlapped with one another at times as they extended all the way to the ends of the hall. At that instant, a scene naturally appeared in Klein's mind. Devout believers were prostrated on the ground as they proceeded forward, slamming their foreheads heavily onto the ground after covering a certain distance, leaving blood oozing out. Noticing Gehrman Sparrow look around without any scrutiny, Alger probed, the ancient sun god? At that moment, he felt the baffling sensation of a cold wind blowing from Gehrman Sparrow's side. He suspected that hidden around them were shadows or wraiths. Recalling the strange restraints the mutated curly-haired baboon was under, Alger made a vague theory that he didn't voice out. Upon hearing the hanged man's question, Klein had wanted to chuckle and reply, "You can also call him the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God," but he felt that such a tone and choice of words was closer to that of the fool and not Gehrman Sparrow. Hence, he held himself back and nodded slightly. "It's not hard to tell." Alger silently heaved a sigh of relief as he held a sense of anticipation for the item buried deep underneath the cathedral. The two simultaneously decided to walk towards the end of the hall. When they approached it, Klein finally saw the staircase that led downwards. "An underground area?" he asked succinctly. Alger shook his head. "I can't be sure. I've never gone down." Although Kalangos had attempted to venture in, he returned in less than 10 minutes with his aura becoming relatively weak. Klein nodded thoughtfully and said in passing, "You seem to be very familiar with him." If it were said by anyone else, Alger would have pretended to have not heard it or answer directly. But deep in his heart, the world Gehrman Sparrow was Mr. Fool's blessed. His question could possibly represent the intentions of that existence, so he needed to view them seriously. After deliberating for a few seconds, Alger said in a deep voice, "We were fellow townsmen, and we were servants at the same cathedral." The priest there was an easily irritated person who enjoyed punishing the servants. Kalangos couldn't bear it and escaped secretly to become a pirate. So there was such a past. Mr. Hanged Man is also a man with a story. Klein didn't probe deeper as he headed down the staircase in the extremely silent cathedral ruins. Although his footsteps were extremely light, they still sounded obvious in such an environment as they echoed. Soon, the two of them came to the end of the staircase and saw the opening of an arched door. On both sides of the opening were two shadows that stood there silently in an immutable fashion. Klein and Alger halted at the same time as they looked at the two shadows, only to discover that they were two stone statues. They were both men with their surface being grayish-white. One of them wore full-body armor that resembled a barrel, and the other wore a jacket that looked more contemporary. Their expressions were writhing in pain as their eyes protruded as though they were glaring at something. Upon seeing this scene, Klein realized something as he recalled the encounter outside. He and Alger had also shown signs of petrification, and it was thankful that they extricated themselves of the effects, or they might have really become statues. Don't tell me they're humans who met with the same situation. If we had been petrified, would we be moved down here, standing guard at this door opening for centuries or even millennia? The source of that petrifying power isn't afraid of these ruins? Klein felt explicable horror as his scalp tingled. He controlled his emotions and turned his head to look at the hanged man. He discovered that the pupils of the boorish man at sea had similarly dilated and was clutching the dagger tightly. Mr. Hanged Man has come to the same conclusion without me needing to speak further. Klein pointed at the door opening and said, there might be even more stone statues inside. Alger nodded as he said worriedly and jokingly, let's hope we don't see ourselves. If we're convinced that we have escaped the effects of petrification, only to see our statues in this underground area, that would be quite the horror story. Klein thought for 2 seconds and said to the hanged man, do you have night vision? His true meaning was that the light of the lantern was especially eye-catching in the dark catacombs and that it might easily cause unwanted developments. Therefore, it was best to extinguish the flame if he had night vision. And he believed that Mr. Hanged Man was able to read in between the lines. Alger replied frankly, yes. As a beyonder of the sailor pathway who could dive, it was a given that he had night vision. Klein glanced at him without a word, but his meaning was obvious. Then why are you still using a lantern? Alger seriously replied, firstly, it's to misdirect the enemy into instinctively believing that I don't have night vision because of my use of a lantern. When they destroy my lantern and try hard to create a dark environment, I'll give them a pleasant surprise. How sinister. Klein was momentarily at a loss for words. Alger continued, secondly, it's to avoid situations similar to the City of Silver. There might be extreme darkness lurking within complete darkness. Makes sense. Klein didn't insist that Alger extinguish the lantern as he first stepped past the two stone statues. Under their pain-frozen gazes, he stepped into the entrance that led underground. As he didn't know what the petrified statues represented, nor did he know if they were completely dead, Klein didn't attempt to shatter them to obtain their beyonder characteristics and mystical items. Chapter 8:11. The picture in the catacombs. After passing through the door opening and going underground, there wasn't a sliver of natural light in front of Klein and Alger. The ceiling was intact, preventing any crimson moonlight from seeping in after penetrating the mist. Alger raised the lantern in his hand, lighting up the area up ahead with a limited dim yellow glow. Klein took a glance and discovered at least 6 stone statues of both sexes. They were entirely grayish-white in color, and even their clothes looked like they were engraved. These stone statues included elves, giants, and humans that had an ancient dress sense. Apart from their frozen expressions of pain and despair, there wasn't anything similar. Klein felt a chill down his back when he saw their eyeballs watching him without moving, having made the connection that they were once alive. He felt that darkness ruled the depths of this passageway, as though a terrifying monster had widened its mouth as it lay in wait for the two to walk into its belly. Reining in their stirring emotions, Klein and Alger remained silent as they passed through the grayish-white statues with warped expression, and they proceeded forward. After walking for more than 10 seconds, Klein didn't need to use Señor's night vision to see the damaged and dark murals thanks to the lantern. There were a few murals that were relatively intact, allowing them to recognize what was being depicted. They were no doubt focused on the cross that glowed and the grand figure that stood before it. This blurry and solemn figure either faced cities that had been flooded, stepped upon fractured lands, or looked up at the starry sky where it locked eyes with the pairs of evil and maniacal eyes. When the apocalypse happens, the ancient sun god will rescue the world? This is somewhat similar to the murals that Little Sun and the others found in the true Creator's temple. Or perhaps it's just plagiarism from both sides, with no one giving up on working towards this goal. After all, it's to emphasize that they were once the Messiah and a deity worthy of one's faith. Klein quickly swept his gaze across the wall as he slowly entered the depths of the passageway. Alger was also observing the damaged murals when he suddenly suppressed his voice and said, "I suspect that the true, fallen Creator's description of himself has references to some of the content here. Indeed, everyone has the same views." Klein lowered death knell and chuckled. "I won't be surprised if we see matters related to the true Creator up ahead. That might be a particular connection between him and the Creator that the City of Silver believes in." Alger agreed with Gehrman Sparrow's judgment. The duo continued ahead as they tried hard to soften their steps. However, there were still some echoes that reverberated in that extremely silent environment. At this moment, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He immediately took 2 steps forward and put himself in front of Alger, blocking out most of the lantern's light. Less than 2 seconds later, he heard a dull sound emitting from afar. Thump. 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 The ground shook gently as the sounds became clearer. Then, Klein saw a figure nearly 4 meters tall walk out. It was also grayish-white in color, with armor plating patterns engraved on its body. Its head had goat horns and a mouth that resembled a hound's. Its half-opened mouth revealing snarling fangs. And what attracted attention the most were its pair of eyes which burned red and the 6 pairs of white membraned wings. Thump. 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 The monster held an 8-meter-long stone trident as it slowly entered a passageway. It shook the land with every step as its great weight was spread out. Although Klein hadn't seen it before, he instantly recognized what it was. It was a 6-winged gargoyle. Its core crystal was one of the main ingredients of a marionettist, and the beyonder powers it possessed were extremely special and indefensible. Based on its external build and from what it's made of, it definitely has extremely potent combat strength while not being afraid of most damage. All it needs to cause terrifying damage is to storm over and perform a downward smash with its stone trident. Klein relaxed his left hand and wasn't in a rush to react. He and Alger remained on the spot, one using his body, and the other using his clothes to conceal the lantern's light. Thump. 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 The 6-winged gargoyle didn't look towards the duo, and it instead passed through the passageway, its footsteps slowly distancing themselves from them. Indeed, it's not very perceptive. It's no wonder Kalangos was able to venture deep down and return safely. Klein proceeded forward again when the footsteps were undetectable as he went past the crossroads. In fact, with his current strength and gear, and his understanding of his target, killing a 6-winged gargoyle wasn't something too dangerous. Furthermore, the hanged man could provide him with help. The reason why he gave up attacking it was because he had no idea how many 6-winged gargoyles there were in the catacombs. Once a battle ensued, any large commotion could result in them swarming over. When that happened, they could only escape using traveling. In addition, if they were to stir the existence in the ruins that even nearby beyonder creatures were afraid of, the problem would only worsen. Curbing one's greed was a premise for a risky exploration. Alger was also rather pleased at the crazy adventurer's calm and rational actions. His suspicion was that Gehrman Sparrow was under the orders of Mr. Fool, thus, resisting his urge to attack the 6-winged gargoyle. The calmer he appears, the crazier he will be when he encounters his true target. As this thought flashed in Alger's mind, he followed Gehrman Sparrow straight down the crossroads. The murals on both sides remained damaged, and they were still describing the greatness and holiness of the ancient sun god. Finally, Klein and Alger arrived at the ends of the passageway. Here, there was an 8-meter-tall stone double door. It depicted various symbols of death, sleep, end, new birth, and beginnings. A tomb? Klein turned to say to Alger. Alger nodded and said, it might also be a temple. Clearly, he was also wondering if it was both a temple and tomb. The grayish-white stone door before the duo wasn't shut completely. It was cracked open with a tiny gap that allowed a child passage. Alger glanced at the floor and walked over. Putting the lantern down and securing his dagger, he pressed his hands onto one side of the door. He slowly drew a breath as he bent his knees, his arm muscles swelling suddenly. Silently, the gap widened significantly. Klein pricked up his brows when he saw this scene, feeling somewhat astonished because the hanged man's pushing of the door didn't produce any sound at all. He didn't doubt an ocean songster's strength, but he didn't believe that it could prevent the stone door from making contact with the ground. As he moved his gaze down, Klein saw a pool of slightly sticky liquid gathered under the door. He quietly produced a lubricant effect. Mr. Hanged Man is very meticulous. Is this the power of a seafarer or an ocean songster? He probably also used the powers of a wind blast to control an air cushion, thus, resulting in this door silently opening. Klein roughly figured out the reason. Although he approached the stone door, he wasn't eager to enter it. Through the widened gap, he observed the scene inside. Reflected in the eyes of the wraith was the corner of the room where there was a row of grayish-white stone coffins. It is indeed a catacomb. As for whether it's also a temple, it's an unknown for now. As Klein thought, he took out Lamino's travels with his left hand. On it were beyonder powers that were suitable to handle matters related to the death domain. Meanwhile, he used a silver dagger to quickly create a wall of spirituality and sealed the iron cigar case to prevent Azek's copper whistle from causing the dead to rise from their graves. Alger also drew his dagger again and placed his left palm over it before sliding his palm outwards. Amidst light crackling sounds, the dagger swirled with silver bolts of lightning that snaked outwards. Having made their preparations, Klein, who was acting as the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, was first to pass through the door and into the tomb. Of course, Wraith Senor had already acted as a scout by circling the tomb before he entered. To a marionettist, there was no need to take risks on many matters once they had a marionette. The tomb's ceiling was soaked with water droplets, a clear indication of the humidity. The room was divided into two regions that each had 12 grayish-white stone coffins. In the middle was a circular region where there appeared to be a beautiful and complicated picture placed on the ground. Klein didn't approach it as he stopped Alger. Then, he controlled Senor to appear as it quickly floated to a spot above the circular region. Admiral of Blood. Alger's facial muscles twitched. Although he had already guessed so, he couldn't stop his subconscious reactions when he saw it with his own eyes. At this moment, Senor descended and was able to fully take in the scene in the central region. The picture had dark, dull colors with the background being filled with blurry figures. In the foreground was a long table. On the table was a figure with a resplendent cross glowing from it, and surrounding the figure were 3 people shrouded in shadows. One was handsome and youthful, another solemn and bold, and the last looking wise with his white beard. The 3 pairs of eyes exuded an indescribable sense of evil, just like the actions of their owners. One of them had ripped off the figure's arm, stuffing it into their mouths, and gnawing at it as blood was filling his mouth. Another held up a brain and sucked at its juices, while the last had dug out a beating heart, chewing at it in a ravenous manner. In contrast to them, in the figure's chest was a long and wide crack. Sitting cross-legged in there was a dark and sinister infant who was masticating on the intestines that had fresh blood gushing down. These 4 entities seemed to sense someone prying into their act as they looked up in unison, as though they were staring at any being that placed their eyes on the picture. Chapter 8:12, Myth from Another Perspective. Upon clearly seeing the picture through Señor's vision, Klein's heart raced so loudly that even he could hear it. As a seer who was good at interpreting revelations and symbolism, he felt his blood gush to his head, leaving his head swelling. It seemed to prevent him from engaging in thinking deeper into it. Even so, there was an ethereal voice belonging to him that resounded in his mind. It was filled with alarm. That figure that's dismembered and eaten likely represents the ancient sun god, the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God which the City of Silver believes in. And I've seen the three evil figures surrounding him before. In the underground ruin in Backlund, the place that sealed that terrifying evil spirit. They existed in the form of a statue but didn't look as evil as the picture depicts them to be. They each respectively represent the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom. Suddenly, Klein recalled the name he had once received, one that he had directly received when looking straight at the eternal blazing sun, White Angel. No way. Could it be that the eternal blazing sun was once an angel by the ancient sun god's side? Little Sun once mentioned that they heard an ecclesiastic's penitence and prophesy of a matter in Afternoon Town. One of the sentences was, "The kings often came to the palace belonging to the dusk to conspire." The eternal blazing sun was originally named White Angel, which is also a king of angels, one that betrayed that creator. And he, and the Lord of storms, the God of knowledge and wisdom, and the dark infant who I have no idea what it represents had benefited the most out of consuming the City of Silver's creator. The Bibles of the various churches mention that the three most ancient deities were born from the original creator spirit. In a sense, it's actually hinting at this dark history. If my theories are correct, then the Lord of storms and the God of knowledge and wisdom are likely the kings of angels that served the creator, the ancient sun god, who the City of Silver worships. Perhaps they should be addressed as Wind Angel and Wisdom Angel. This way, all 8 kings of angels are accounted for: Dark Angel, White Angel, Wind Angel, Wisdom Angel, Angel of Imagination, Angel of Time, Angel of Fate, and Red Angel. From what Little Sun heard, and from the subsequent developments of these kings of angels, it seems that apart from the 2 sons of God, Ammon and Adam, the other kings of angels had betrayed the creator. No way, this ancient sun god ended way too tragedy. However, this picture might not be real. It might be sacrilege. It's still suspect. I wonder who the dark infant sitting in the ancient sun god's abdomen represents. It feels like the true creator is the greatest suspect. Klein instantly thought of many matters as he felt the urge to leave and pretend that he hadn't seen the picture the deeper he pondered over the matter. At that instant, he felt an irrepressible sense of fear, to the point of feeling that the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom were casting their gaze down from the astral world in his imagination. Who left this picture behind? Who could have known so many secrets and clearly be on the ancient sun god's side? One of the other angels or saints that have been constantly following the City of Silver creator with enduring faith? Klein's back oozed with sweat as his body trembled slightly. Although Alger's observational abilities were inferior to Miss Justice, he was an experienced beyonder. In this environment that needed a high sense of vigilance and awareness, it wasn't difficult for him to notice that something odd had happened to Gehrman Sparrow. What happened? He asked with a suppressed tone. Klein suddenly snapped to his senses as he made Senor move his gaze away as he pointed at the circular region in the middle. You'll know just by looking at it. A picture that can make Gehrman tremble? Will it make me lose control immediately? It's probably not a problem since he's not stopping me but suggesting that I take a look. However, I cannot eliminate the possibility that he has already lost his reasoning and is just acting normal. Many thoughts flashed through Alger's mind, but ultimately, he steadily walked towards the central region with his lantern in hand. After about 8 steps, he saw the gloomy picture. In just 3 seconds, Alger's hands trembled with the dagger and lantern in his grip. It was as though he was suffering from some kind of mental illness. Thanks to the world Gehrman, he had once seen the 6 Orthodox deities' anthropomorphic statues in the Tarot Club. He naturally recognized that the arm-eating, heart-ripping, and brain-guzzling figures were respectively the Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom. In the past, he had committed a disloyal act to the church whilst under Kalangos's coercion. He joined the Tarot Club and distanced himself from the chasm of storm, believed in Mr. Fool and wished to gain more strength and power, and he leaked the church's intel and was unmotivated in certain matters. Even so, he ultimately believed himself to be a believer of the Lord of Storms, albeit someone who wasn't devout and passionate enough. But at that moment, he felt deep down in his heart that he had committed a grave sin of sacrilege. He nearly dug out his eyes in horror. To not kill myself directly, it means that I really have become a false believer. Alger didn't dare take another look as he turned around and looked at Gehrman Sparrow. With a trembling voice, he asked, "Those 3 are kings of angels?" "I can't give you confirmation. All I can say is that the eternal blazing sun is intimately connected to the white angel," Klein vaguely answered. As expected. Alger immediately felt that the possibility that the Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom were once kings of angels. As for Gehrman Sparrow not being able to confirm the situation, he wasn't too surprised. It wasn't odd since he was only a blessed and not Mr. Fool. Alger was just about to say something when he heard a sharp screech. It was as though someone was using their fingernails to scratch the lid of a stone coffin. No, it wasn't an analogy, and it was exactly what was happening. Schwing. Rip. Sizzle. Sharp, jarring sounds of scratching sounded from 3 stone coffins on both sides. Then, the heavy lids were either flung open or blasted open as 3 warped figures stood up. One of them wore an ancient white robe that had nearly turned gray. Its face was riddled with pockmarks, and across its neck, forehead, and the back of its hands were deep eyes. Beside it was a figure with huge palms and thick fingers that looked as though they were made of wood. Slathered around its body was a layer of yellow-green pus as a mist of the same color emanated out of it, seemingly capable of eroding away the stone coffin. Opposite the two was a figure in a tattered brown jacket with a triangular hat with a skull on it. Many parts of its skin had rotted away, revealing the bone beneath. Under its clothes and pants, thick and slimy tentacles that had fish scales embedded inside had burrowed out as it released a domineering, savage, tyrannous, and terrifying aura. This even made Klein feel as though he was facing a high-sequence beyonder from the storm pathway. However, its body didn't appear to reach that level. The 3 deceased bodies that crawled out of the coffin cast their eyes in the direction of Gehrman Sparrow and Alger. One produced silver bolts of lightning that crackled. Another reflected the duo's figures in the countless eyes it had. The last one spread its yellow-green mist and created brown vines. At the same time, they stormed over with loud and hurried footsteps as a 6-winged gargoyle was rushing over. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't panic. His Laymanos Travels-wielding left hand reached into his pocket, tore open the wall of spirituality, and used 2 fingers to pick out Azek's copper whistle. Right on the heels of that, he flicked his wrist and threw the copper whistle to the other side of the room. Without any surprises, he saw the 3 deceased bodies with terrifying auras turn around and rush towards it like trained hounds. Upon seeing this scene, Alger's gaze froze before he made a decision. He threw his lantern and rushed for the door. His experience told him that while Gehrman Sparrow could deal with the 3 terrifying deceased, he needed to hold back the 6-winged gargoyle to prevent it from interfering with the crazy adventurer's battle. Bang! Just as Alger arrived at the door, he saw the double door crack. A 6-winged gargoyle was charging in with an 8-meter-long trident. He immediately drew a gasp as his eyes burned with rage. His muscles swelled, and under the aid of the wind, he charged forward and brandished the dagger that swirled with silver lightning. Bang! He dodged the stone trident that smashed downwards, and he cleaved at the gargoyle's abdomen with a dagger. Instantly, sparks flew as rubble sprayed everywhere. Alger flew backwards as the gargoyle's charge was disrupted. Bang! Alger heavily slammed into the ground. As he had created an air cushion in time, he didn't suffer any serious injuries. And at this moment, the three deceased bodies had gathered together to vie for Azek's copper whistle. Klein looked at them and calmly flipped Lamino's travels to a charred yellow page with complicated patterns and symbols. This was a demigod-level power that he recently recorded, Lightning Storm. Then, Klein slid one finger across the notebook page with his death knell-wielding hand. At the same time, he looked at the three mutated deceased bodies who were vying for Azek's copper whistle. With a deep voice, he greeted them, "Bye-bye." Amidst sizzling sounds, bolts of lightning burst forth, meshing together to form a hurricane, enveloping the region where Azek's copper whistle was, as well as the three deceased bodies. The entire tomb was instantly lit up like it was daytime. Even Alger nearly failed to open his eyes. His body instinctively trembled as a result of the terrifying aura. With the aid of the wind, he leaped up with the hurricane taking form in his eyes. He once again charged at the six-winged gargoyle that attempted to attack Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 8:13 Tyrant. Aside from the Sailor Pathway's raging blow, Alger knew that he didn't have any powers that were adequate against the six-winged gargoyle's strong body due to its immunity to lightning strikes. Of course, directly creating a resonance with its hearing organs and body of heart and mind through the use of his singing was the most effective method. If this encounter had been anywhere else, Alger definitely would have exploited the gargoyle's great weight and lack of agility to circle around it. Then, as he sang to affect it, he would attack the same spot with sharp wind blades, slowly grinding away at his enemy through the cumulative damage over time. But now, he was in a catacomb, and due to the environment's limitations, any acts of directly avoiding it would only cause the gargoyle to turn its gaze to Gehrman Sparrow. It would then attack the crazy adventurer with its 8-meter-long trident, preventing him from seizing the opportunity to finish off the three deceased bodies. And most important of all, Alger suspected that his singing will have more adverse effects on Gehrman Sparrow than what the gargoyle was capable of. Bang! The stone trident crashed heavily into the ground, blasting open an exaggerated crater. It left the catacomb shaking as if an earthquake had happened. As for Alger, he didn't attempt to parry it. With the help of strong winds, he dodged to the right and soared up, agilely dodging the gargoyle's attack as he dashed for the monster's head. At that moment, he saw the grayish-white eyes which burned with flames. Alger's mind turned sluggish as his body instantly stiffened. He had the feeling of being petrified again, but his skin didn't show signs of spreading grayish-white colors. Thanks to the inertia, he continued soaring upwards, but he wasn't able to brandish his dagger. He slammed straight into the gargoyle's head before loudly being repelled backward, his body aching in pain. The heavy grayish-white trident reflected in his eyes again as his thoughts were sluggish, making it impossible for him to put up any effective resistance. Suddenly, a hand grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him to the side. Bang! Rubble flew as sparks were produced. The gargoyle's heavy trident had blasted open a huge crater again. Alger's body trembled as his vision regained its clarity while his thoughts were rapidly restored back to normal. He was like someone who woke up from an irresistible nightmare which he was helpless against as he regained control over his body. Only then did he realize that Gehrman Sparrow had appeared by his side. There were still remnant flashes of lighting and sizzling sounds in the corner where the three deceased bodies were. Do not lock gazes with it. Attack its chest. As Klein pulled Alger away quickly in a bid to dodge the stone trident, he succinctly advised his companion. Alger had personally experienced and witnessed many battles, so without further explanation from Gehrman Sparrow, he knew what the latter meant. He stopped receiving aid as he nimbly circled to the gargoyle's flank. Tap! 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 He ran towards the gargoyle and waited for the stone trident to sweep over him, before soaring high up with the help of the strong gales to dodge the attack. Whoosh! Another hurricane pushed Alger towards the gargoyle's chest. During this process, he closed his eyes, pulled back his right arm, and bulged his muscles. Then, with his ability to judge distances as a seafarer, he threw out his dagger-wielding right fist. Howling wind blades and sizzling lightning were emitted along with his fist. Bang! Alger's right fist heavily struck the gargoyle's chest, producing an explosive effect. It caused the gargoyle stone to be covered in fine cracks as silver lightning snaked around. Following that, the cracks widened and depressed into a pit. With a cracking sound, his dagger exploded, turning into countless fragments that scattered everywhere. The strong recoil sent Alger flying back. In midair, he saw through the corner of his eye that the hatted German sparrow had at some point in time circled to the front and cocked his revolver. Right on the heels of that, the cold adventurer suddenly raised his hand and aimed the black barrel right at the gargoyle. Bang! Amidst a loud echo, a bullet tore through the pit in the gargoyle's chest and pierced it. Following the explosive boom, the grayish-white stone monster convulsed a few times before the flames in its eyes were extinguished. After a brief pause, it collapsed like a mountain, producing an exaggerated sound and earthquake-like shaking. Death Knell had delivered a lethal blow. And at this moment, Alger had just maintained his balance and found his footing thanks to the wind. Klein didn't speak to him or search for the spoils of war. He immediately turned around and headed for the charred area where Azek's copper whistle sat silently. Slippery tentacles covered in fish scales moved as the deceased body with nearly half its body gone had stood up. Bolts of lightning continued snaking around its body. It was the domineering, savage, tyrannous deceased body that wore a tattered brown jacket with a triangular captain's hat. It was missing its left arm and right leg, as well as having half its head. Its body was covered in traces of charred and melted flesh. But even so, it didn't sleep in peace. It was still attempting to fuse with the surrounding flesh and blood in order to obtain a stronger state. One had to know that Klein had used Lightning Storm, which he had recorded from the Sea God Scepter. Even if the act of recording had reduced its might, it was definitely the beyonder power at the demigod level. Just the fact that the other two deceased went silent without letting out a grunt was a testament of its might. This awakened deceased body is problematic. Klein's heart stirred as he made Senor leap onto the smooth surface of Azek's copper whistle before attempting to reflect onto the deceased fish scale on its slippery tentacle. At that moment, through the marionette, Klein sensed a tyrannical and high-level repulsive force. The wraith was unable to possess it. Senor was even repelled as it couldn't help but lose its invisibility. Upon seeing this, Alger didn't question the situation. He raised his hands and created a spiraling wind around the deceased body, hoping to restrain its actions. However, the wind didn't sweep inwardly, as though it was afraid of something. It was forcefully dissipated as it rapidly vanished. The only thing to be happy about was that the deceased body didn't immediately attack the duo. Instead, it jumped to the left, bent its back, and attempted to pick up Azek's copper whistle. Klein immediately flicked his wrist and precisely flipped Lamino's Travels to the page with Abyss Shackles. This was a beyonder power which Emlyn had recorded, one belonging to a Sequence 7 vampire. As Klein swiped his death knell-wielding right hand onto the notebook, the shadows around the deceased body suddenly came to life and manifested chains that shackled it firmly to the ground. Taking advantage of his opponent's brief pause, Klein raised his revolver in a deadpan manner. Different colors, red, green, and white, immediately appeared in his vision. Aiming at the white, Klein pulled the trigger. Bang! A pale golden beam shot into the head of the deceased body, causing it to rupture immediately into a spray of blood. At the same time, the purifying bullet also emitted a sun-like radiance that illuminated the target's body. The deceased body melted like wax as it bent its waist and lost its balance, collapsing right beside Azek's copper whistle. Monsters without any intelligence that only move on instinct are much easier to deal with than beyonders of the same level. However, am I letting the copper whistle down? Ever since it was given to me, it has suffered explosions, the catharsis of lightning, and the purification of sunlight. Life sure isn't easy for it. Klein repented for a second before controlling Senor to pick up the ancient and exquisite copper whistle and stuffing it inside his body. He didn't directly head over, afraid that a deceased body would awaken. Hence, he continued letting Senor to investigate the fellow who could resist the possession effect. Klein suspected that the deceased had an item of a rather high level. Soon, Senor in his non-wraith form touched something and pulled it out. It was a card. On the face of the card was a man wearing a papal tiara with both hands held up. Before him were prostrated believers, and behind him was lightning, dark clouds, gales, and waves. Klein was very familiar with the man because he had a portrait of this person in another set of attire. It was Emperor Roselle. And to the top left of the pontiff dressed Roselle, there was a line of text formed from resplendent starlight, Sequence 0, Tyrant. The card of blasphemy from the storm pathway? The Tyrant card? Klein instantly recalled how the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom addressed the Lord of Storms, Tyrant. Alger also saw the card of blasphemy as his gaze froze instantly. Flames of greed flared up in his eyes. He took a deep breath and moved his gaze away as he looked to the side and said, "The battle was intense. Perhaps other entities deep inside this cathedral have been awoken by us. So, let's store away the things as quickly as possible and prepare to leave." "Mr. Hanged Man, do you think I'm not aware of that? There's no need for you to nag. What happened to our tacit teamwork from before?" "Heh, indeed. The Tyrant card has affected you. You can hardly calm down, and you have become talkative." As Klein got Wraith Senor to pick up the card of blasphemy and enter one of the deceased bodies to accelerate the production of the Beyonder characteristic, he coldly said, "You've already wasted 5 seconds." Alger was taken aback. Without saying another word, he walked to the remains of the 6-winged gargoyle and dug out the eyeball that glowed red. Then, he patiently waited for a moment and reached into its shattered back to extract a gargoyle translucent crystal. Elsewhere, with the Wraith's help, the deceased body that was covered with yellow-green pus produced a blob of brown soil. It had roots to it with hidden blood vessels. It appeared rather strange. Without wasting time to guess at the sequence or pathway it belonged to, Klein got Senor to store it away before heading for the deceased body whose slippery tentacles were still twitching slightly, to accelerate the production of the Beyonder characteristic. Seeing what looked like a jellyfish with azure blue seawater in it take form, Klein and Alger suddenly heard a dragged-out sound. Sigh. This sighing came from deep within the cathedral, bringing along with it an indescribable sense of ancientness. Chapter 8:14 Disappeared. The long sigh that sounded from deep within the cathedral had left the back muscles of Klein and Alger tense as they were pumped with adrenaline. Without any hesitation, Klein's left glove turned transparent as he vanished, appearing beside the Hanged Man. As he reached out to grab his shoulder, Senor also picked up the jellyfish-like Beyonder characteristic and, with the help of Mirror Leap, returned back to the gold coin inside the iron cigar case. Right on the heels of that, Klein's and Alger's bodies turned incorporeal and invisible, leaving the catacombs silent again. The two of them were directly teleported into midair a distance away. Their figures came into existence amidst the shadows of the clouds and the crimson moonlight. Subconsciously, Klein and Alger turned their heads in unison to look at the primitive island, wishing to know if any changes would happen to it. When they heard that sigh, they had relied on their instincts and experience to immediately escape despite not sensing any actual danger. Now, they couldn't help but feel curious and puzzled. In their vision, the thick mist that cloaked the primitive island had quickly dispersed. The moonlight shone straight down without anything obstructing it. Amidst howling winds, Klein and Alger floated in midair as they saw the primitive island's present state through the sparse mist. It had vanished. This primitive island that had a demigod feathered serpent and all kinds of beyonder creatures had vanished. The region it was in had dark blue seawater which was almost black, was ebbing slightly. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Alger couldn't help but reach his hand into his pocket where he touched the six-winged gargoyle's core crystal that had left his mind sluggish. If not for his battle spoils still being in existence, he would have suspected if it was all a dream. He wondered if he and Gehrman Sparrow had somewhat gotten lost, that they hadn't found the real primitive island, and ended up completing the exploration in their dreams. Klein had similar thoughts as well. He even felt as though he was hallucinating. After all, a giant island with so many powerful creatures that hid secrets from mythical times couldn't just vanish without a word. Even the seawater didn't show any corresponding signs of its existence. Thankfully, I didn't hesitate at all and chose to immediately escape. Otherwise, Mr. Hanged Man and I might really vanish, never to be found again. Klein suddenly felt a deep sense of joy. He didn't dare stay any longer as he activated traveling once again and vanished with Alger as they traversed the spirit world. And the final scene of this body of water that froze in their eyes was of mist spreading once again with increasing density. After another teleportation, Klein and Alger returned to the deserted island. They stood on a reef and watched the waves strike the shore loudly. Alger looked around and heaved a silent sigh of relief. He took out the core crystal of the six-winged gargoyle and said, "This is a shared spoil of war. You get to choose first." After weighing the matter, he considered the six-winged gargoyle to be a monster that the duo had killed together. As for the three deceased bodies, they were solely Gehrman Sparrows. Klein didn't directly respond. He made Senior float beside him as he took out the tyrant card, the brown soil beyonder characteristic, and the jellyfish-like beyonder characteristic. The latter was suspected to be that of an ocean songster's. After doing all of this, he said, "One battle. I'll choose first." Thrice. He meant that in the battle the duo faced, they had fought three deceased bodies and a six-winged gargoyle. He had contributed greatly in the entire battle, so the spoils of war received in the tomb belonged to the pool. Of course, based on the contributions, Gehrman Sparrow had the right to choose first and choose 3 consecutive times. Alger was taken aback as he gained a new understanding of the crazy adventurer. He then nodded. "Okay." Klein immediately reached his hand towards his marionette and calmly took the tyrant card with Roselle's face on it. This counts as twice. With the card of blasphemy, along with the sea god scepter, he could barely be considered a fake demigod when taking action in his spirit body state. This was also very useful when acting as sea god. Of course, the greatest value the tyrant card provided was the high sequence potion formulas of the storm pathway, as well as the subtle ability to sense the ingredients needed after reaching sequence 4. And it was precisely because of this that Klein didn't wait till they returned to the City of Generosity, Biome, to split the spoils of war. He was afraid that the tyrant card would directly attract Sea King John Cotman. "It's up to you to say how many times it counts." Alger didn't retort, nor did he plan on objecting to Gehrman Sparrow's claim. He watched as Gehrman reached for the jellyfish-like beyonder characteristic which likely corresponded to Ocean Songster. To Klein, it could be used to create a mystical item in the storm domain, thus, replacing the Murloc cufflink that had been taken away by Admiral Hell. It could also be bestowed to the Rorstad Archipelago's resistance in the future to raise their survivability at sea. Of course, the condition was that they had greatly pleased Sea God. Putting away the tyrant card and the jellyfish-like beyonder characteristic, Klein glanced at the Hanged Man, indicating that it was his turn to choose. Alger deliberated and said, "Can I choose the sequence 4 potion formula from that card of blasphemy?" "No problem." Klein nodded without much of an expression. "I'll give it to you in the future." Although the tyrant card had been activated, using it was bound to cause quite a stir. Therefore, to be safe, Klein planned on heading above the grey fog to study it after he returned to Backlund. All right. Even with Alger's stateliness, he couldn't help but smile. After this adventure, once his digestion of the ocean songster was almost done, he could showcase his strength and take the path of being advanced by the church. When the time came, drinking an additional potion wasn't a big problem. Even if he didn't give birth to a child, just time alone could allow him to resolve the matter completely. The key obstacle was that going from sequence 5 to sequence 4 was a qualitative transformation. It was a sublimation of life's natural order. Countless ocean songsters in the Church of Storms had worked hard for decades, but they had failed to obtain an opportunity. Alger didn't believe that he, as a mixed blood, one who had promoted himself from a servant, would receive any special treatment. He felt that not being ostracized was already something to be happy about, a result of his ability to build social ties. Furthermore, in the church, the potion was directly given for the advancement to sequence 4. There was no advanced understanding of the formula or its preparation. For Alger to gain an advantage in this intense competition, he had to have other ideas apart from being ranked within the top 3 in terms of contributions. His present line of thought was to kill a famous pirate. From him, he could obtain the cataclysmic interrer's potion formula. Then, he could let the clues point towards the mutated deceased body in the primitive island. It was likely a powerful pirate who had once been active at sea before suddenly vanishing. This way, the upper echelons of the Church of Storms would definitely suspect that this powerful missing pirate had obtained the card of blasphemy, and this undeniable reality could be verified via many different means. Alger could use the advantage of already knowing the cataclysmic interrer's potion formula to obtain a chance to become a sequence 4. Of course, that's working on the premise that the church doesn't have a sealed artifact that can directly wipe out any corresponding memories. If this method doesn't work, and there's no real way to advance, I can only secretly gather the corresponding ingredients and prepare the required ritual for advancement. Once I become a sequence 4, I'll immediately leave the church and become a pirate king. Alger reined in his thoughts and watched as Gehrman Sparrow took away the brown soil-like Beyonder characteristic. Glancing at the remaining items, he put away the grayish-white translucent crystal and handed the 6-winged gargoyle's eyeball to Gehrman Sparrow. With him not lacking any powerful offensive means, and him being well-rounded and it came to the sea and land, it was rather useful for him if the Beyonder ingredient could be made into a mystical item. Back in the tomb, if it wasn't because he was uncertain if psychic piercing could affect the gargoyle, and the battle situation didn't allow for any mistakes, he would have chosen to first use the whip of mind. After splitting the spoils of war, putting them in different boxes, and sealing them with walls of spirituality, Klein stored away Senor. Reaching out his hand to grab the hanged man, their figures turned faint as they entered the spirit world. After the traveling was completed, the two appeared on a mountain beside the sea in the Biome city outskirts. It was still close to the cemetery, and it was as though they had never left. Alger didn't harp on the topic as he nodded at Gehrman Sparrow. If you need any mystical items created, I shall bear the corresponding costs. It's a pleasure working with you. Wearing the transparent glove, Klein tersely answered before vanishing. He left the hanged man behind, and he directly teleported himself to a secluded corner in Biome City. Next, I need to select a lucky pirate. Klein surveyed his area as he muttered silently and stretched his fingers before walking out into the street. Of course, he didn't forget to change his appearance. He also smeared blood over Lamino's travels. After all, there were bounty notices everywhere for Gehrman Sparrow, and Sea King John Cotman remained in this city. If he were recognized or got lost, things would be nasty. On the mountainside outside the city, Alger looked up at the dark night where there were the crimson moon and the countless stars. He slowly inhaled and exhaled, allowing the refreshing and saltiness of the seaside to cleanse his body. The exploration he had just completed was the most dangerous adventure he had ever had. If not for the teleportation from Gehrman Sparrow's creeping hunger, he doubted that they could escape alive. However, as Mr. Fool's blessed, the world should have other trump cards. For example, those demigod-level Beyonder powers in Lamino's travels. But in that case, we might not have successfully reached the tomb, with us encountering more trouble along the way. Yes, that card of blasphemy of the storm pathway is the target that made him restrain his madness. Was an instruction from Mr. Fool? He had already foreseen it. Perhaps, he even knows the existence that produced that sigh from deep within the cathedral. Back then Kalangos might have seen the tyrant card but had lacked the ability to obtain it. That must be why he said that. Alger's mind churned as he slowly walked to the foot of the mountain. Chapter 8:15, After Action Review. Backlund, 160 Buckland Street. Gehrman Sparrow's figure suddenly appeared inside his bedroom as his black trench coat fluttered while his half-top hat remained straight. The Dwayne Dantes lying in bed immediately turned incorporeal, receding into a palm-sized mirror. Probably no one came tonight. Rhodes didn't cause any trouble. Upon seeing the peace and quiet, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief as his body grew a lot taller and his sideburns turned gray. His blue eyes deepened as he transformed into Dwayne Dantes. Meanwhile, watery waves stirred in the mirror as silver light gathered to outline words, "Great Master, I didn't do anything today. No, I seriously acted as the sleeping Dwayne Dantes. In addition, I encountered something. Do you wish to know what it was?" Ignoring Rhodes's desire to be praised in its first sentence, Klein felt his heart skip a beat. As he took off his hat and threw it on the reclining chair beside him, he said in a deep voice, "Tell me." The words on the mirror disintegrated and squirmed into new text. "A lady peeped into this house when she was walking past this street." How does that matter? There are plenty of people who admire the surroundings when passing by every day. Klein was just about to say something when the aqueous light stirred on the mirror's surface, outlining a figure. The person was dressed quite oddly in the eyes of normal people. She wore a spirit medium's black robe. Her eyeshadow and blush were blue. She looked beautiful, but she also had an uncanny appearance. She was none other than Daly Simone. This lady had turned her head to look out as she passed by Unit 160 while on a carriage moving down Buckland Street. She had stared out for more than 3 seconds. Man, she not only had an impression of Dwayne Dantes because of his eyes, but she has also grasped something about the situation? Klein frowned slightly and asked, "Anything else?" "No." As Rhodes presented the word, it sketched what symbolized a sworn oath. Klein nodded and ignored the mirror's passion. He then sent it away. After doing all of this, Klein took out a candle and set up a ritual. He summoned and responded to himself, bringing all the spoils of war and his clothes above the gray fog. He planned on separating Gehrman Sparrow's and Dwayne Dantes's clothes. He didn't wish to miss out on any details in the future. Pa! He snapped a finger and made the candlewick burn with a scarlet flame. Flame! Flame! Klein's gaze froze as he quickly closed his eyes and turned around, his back facing the candle. Then, he controlled Senor to approach the desk. During this process, Senor's body trembled violently, but he ultimately reached out his right hand to extinguish the fire. "I'll sleep for the night and think about it tomorrow." "No, I have the tyrant card on me, and it has already been activated. Although there's the wall of spirituality to seal it, it might not be able to fully screen out the attraction force from those of the same pathway. It might only weaken its influence and take more time. Back when I was in Byam, I came and went quickly, without daring to stay too long." Just as Klein calmed down, he thought of certain problems. A few seconds later, he slowly took a deep breath, raised his hand, and snapped his fingers to light the candle. Following that, he held back the horror in him as he controlled Senor to take another 2 candles to set up the sacrificial ritual. This way, it skipped the step of him responding to the summoning for the entrance to the real world via the flame. After everything was done, Klein turned around with great difficulty as he piously lowered his head. Without looking into the candlelight, he seriously chanted the honorific name of the fool. Via sheer willpower, to the point of him bursting out in tears, he finally completed the ritual and sacrificed all the items, sending them above the gray fog. Phew! Klein exhaled, taking 4 steps counterclockwise, he arrived at the silent mysterious space. Sitting in the fool's seat, he first picked up the tyrant card, and he triggered the content hidden within. The card of blasphemy immediately became 3-dimensional, like a palm-sized book. As he flipped through the pages, each page had a Roselle Gustave. He was either playing the role of a sailor, or he was wearing a captain's hat and holding a sextant, otherwise, he was singing loudly with the sea as his background. Klein was rendered speechless by this sight. He felt increasingly convinced that his fellow Earthling was way too narcissistic. I'll be really impressed if the Demoness card also uses his image. As Klein lampooned, he read through the corresponding contents, analyzing the sequence names, ingredients, and rituals of the storm pathway. Sequence 9, Sailor. Sequence 8, Folk of Rage. Sequence 7, Seafarer. Sequence 6, Wind Blessed. Sequence 5, Ocean Songster. Sequence 4, Cataclysmic Interrer. Sequence 3, Sea King. Sequence 2, Calamity. Sequence 1, Thunder God. Sequence 0, Tyrant. The ritual to become Tyrant, or in other words, the Lord of Storms, is very different from that of the Black Emperor. Firstly, it needs hundreds of thousands of followers to submit and believe in said person out of fear. Secondly, it is to challenge a true deity, in other words, another Sequence 0, and survive. Finally, in this atmosphere of fear and submission, consume the potion to complete the advancement. This sucks. A Sequence 1 who hasn't experienced a qualitative change is to challenge a Sequence 0 true deity. Doesn't that spell almost certain death? Besides, what if there's no Sequence 0 during that era? Then, wouldn't one need to think of a way to nurture one, or to switch to a neighboring pathway? Of course, the ritual might not be necessary. With enough luck, there's still a chance of succeeding by directly drinking the potion. Sea God Calvetua was such an example. It didn't even consume a potion but instead an unconcocted Beyonder characteristic. The core of this ritual is the courage to challenge a deity, with massive feelings of fear and submission? Tyrant doesn't seem to come equipped with the Black Emperor's uniqueness of distorting rules, preventing him from resurrecting from the dead and returning from the void. However, it seems to be able to transform into lightning or light for a short period of time, perhaps capable of creating a planet-level disaster. Emperor Roselle's focus is on the formula and ritual. His description of the Beyonder powers and deity authorities are very vague. Klein casually summoned a piece of paper that wasn't conjured. Using a fountain pen, he recorded the Cataclysmic Interrer's potion formula and wrote a note in the World Gehrman Sparrow's style of speech. Avoid recalling the contents of that picture usually. This was a warning for the hanged man. In the mysterious domain, matters that involved Sequence 0 required caution and carefulness. Care needed to be taken even if it violated common sense. It didn't mean that seeing and discussing that picture on the primitive island meant that they were safe in the outside world. If they often recalled the matter, there might be a day when they were lucky enough to have lightning smite down at them suffering from an unresolvable conundrum that killed them with an aneurysm, or them dying from heatstroke from the sun's radiance. The ritual of the Cataclysmic Interrer is extremely dangerous. It will trigger earthquakes and tsunamis, and the advancer needs to consume the potion in such an environment, holding out until it ends. Klein folded the piece of paper and placed it to the side while putting away the tyrant card. After using divination to confirm that the 3 Beyonder characteristics he obtained were separately the Black Emperor Pathway Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion, Storm Pathway Sequence 5 Ocean Songster, and Planter Pathway Sequence 5 Druid, Klein finally had the time to recall what had happened during his exploration as he considered the information it hid. Eternal blazing sun is clearly of the sun pathway, and that city of silver creator is also known as the ancient sun god. This can be determined from some of the fourth epoch history and the murals of the elves. According to the law of sequence beyonder characteristics conservation of having no sequence 1 when there's a sequence 0, the white angel back then likely wasn't a king of angels. But if he wasn't a king of angels, he had no right to partake in the feast of the city of silver creator. This not only has external elements in play, but it also includes the problem of jumping directly from sequence 2 to sequence 0, which has a high chance of losing control. Either eternal blazing sun had switched pathways to become a god, or the city of silver creator's main authority wasn't the sun. After he defeated the ancient gods, he had already allocated parts of his authority to the angels beside him, making them become kings of angels. Therefore, the elves' murals and the name that eventually spread had only indicated that he once wielded authority over the sun, and that it wasn't an authority he held the entire time. There's also another possibility. The creator, who took over the ancient gods' authorities, had the ability to allow a sequence 2 of the same pathway to advance to sequence 1. Klein's train of thought quickly turned to who had built the cathedral and left behind the mural. Due to the messiness of the various situations, he conjured a piece of goatskin, and he summarized all the points by writing them down to seek out the connection. That primitive island was discovered by Kalangos and Mr. Hanged Man. Kalangos received a mission from the Twilight Hermit Order. To obtain a priceless item, he headed to Backlund to assassinate Duke Negan, and he ended up dying at Mr. Azek's hands. Kalangos told Mr. Hanged Man that deep inside the ruin was a precious item that was in no way worse than Roselle's tarot card, but it was something that could only be obtained at sequence 5. He later obtained creeping hunger and became a pirate admiral, with a strength already equivalent to a sequence 5. That tyrant card remains deep inside the cathedral's catacombs. Kalangos didn't make any subsequent attempts? Or did his attempts fail? That cathedral was built by an existence who worships the ancient sun god. The mural depicts the dark history of the true deities before the cataclysm, and is clearly on the ancient sun god's side. The Twilight Hermit Order is suspected to be established by the Son of God, Adam, with the goal of resurrecting the ancient sun god, the city of silver creator. That primitive island suddenly disappeared as though it never existed. Adam is an angel of imagination. Amongst the Twilight Hermit Order's core members, there's at least one angel of the spectator pathway, Hermes. The Twilight Hermit Order tends to select members of the Sailor, Reader, or Sun pathways. It has a high chance of possessing high-sequence ingredients and items from the Storm domain. There might be angels from the Storm domain in it. Klein lowered his pen and looked at the content listed out as he slowly made a guess. Chapter 8:16, completing the transaction. After listing down all the important points, Klein rapped the edge of the long model table and silently muttered, "The one who sighed in the depths of the cathedral is a member of the Twilight Hermit Order?" Kalangos had caught the eye of the Twilight Hermit Order after he managed to venture deep inside. Later, he obtained an advancement and received creeping hunger, allowing him to become a pirate admiral. If that's the case, it can be understood why he didn't go to the primitive island again to take away the tyrant card after possessing the strength of a sequence 5. It's yours only if it's given. You can't touch it if it's not given. Of course, Kalangos might have established contact with that member of the Twilight Hermit Order during his second visit of the cathedral after possessing enough combat strength. Regardless, that primitive island must have quite a connection with the Twilight Hermit Order. The reason why we arrived at the tomb rather smoothly in the other zones and saw the picture of the kings of angels feasting on the Creator was because that Twilight Hermit Order member had the intention of letting us do so. They are happy to let that lost piece of history spread given the chance. However, their depiction of something from their own standpoints might not be the truth as well. Later, that Twilight Hermit Order member probably sighed because he or she didn't expect us to quickly finish off the awakened deceased bodies and the six-winged gargoyle to obtain the Tyrant card. With how things normally go, we should have been in danger, and he quells everything, talking to us from a distance, making us outer circle members of the Twilight Hermit Order. Klein carefully used he to refer to the existence in the depths of the abandoned cathedral. He even suspected that the person might be the former king of angels, son of God, Adam. Of course, he wasn't certain if the primitive island belonged to the Twilight Hermit Order. He believed that even divination wouldn't give him a certain answer, as there were too many possibilities. It also involved other hidden existences, and any information related to the spirit world would definitely be wiped away or hidden. If it's really as I guessed, does that mean that I missed the chance of joining the Twilight Hermit Order? If I pass their test, then I might be able to take a glance at the second blasphemy slate and obtain the high-sequence potion formulas of the seer pathway. What a pity. However, Gehrman Sparrow has a mysterious origin with a secret existence backing him. This is known by the various factions at sea, and as the most ancient and secret organization, the Twilight Hermit Order will definitely be aware of the corresponding situation. The outcome for Gehrman Sparrow would probably be immediate execution and then having answers obtained via spirit channeling. Klein first found it a pity before feeling afraid. As his thoughts whirred, he even thought of sending the Hanged Man to the primitive island again and seek out an opportunity to make him an outer circle member of the Twilight Hermit Order, so that he could slowly reach its core. Sigh, but the problem is that the primitive island has vanished. Otherwise, Mr. Hanged Man really has a chance of being a quadruple spy. Klein snapped his fingers and made the paper in front of him disappear, throwing the night's exploration to the back of his mind. However, he warned himself that he needed to pay attention to the appearances of any abnormalities in his daily life. He was afraid that it wasn't that the hidden existence deep in the cathedral wasn't able to stop himself and the Hanged Man from escaping, but that he had a deeper motive. If not for the gray fog in him having been sterilized, Klein even suspected if there were any hidden marks left on him. Glancing at the items on the table, Klein first flipped the Tyrant card over and placed it beside the Black Emperor card. Following that, he began considering how he would deal with the remaining spoils of war. He already had plans for the Sequence 5 Druid Beyonder characteristic of the Planter pathway, sell it to Frank Lee via the Hermit Catlia. But the problem is whether I want to accelerate the destruction of this world. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he fell into a dilemma. Allowing a dangerous fellow like Frank Lee to advance to Sequence 5 meant that cows, fish, the sea, and rose bishops would be fearful. No one knew what this fellow, who was no better than a lunatic, would achieve in his experiments after obtaining greater powers. It was an unknown what sort of strange species he could create. What if he plants himself and obtains a bunch of Franks? The world would truly be in danger if that happens. Klein silently exhaled and planned on letting Admiral of Stars vex over this problem. After all, I'll just be selling the Druid Beyonder characteristic normally. Whether Ma'am Hermit wishes to buy it is up to her. Besides, it's only a Sequence 5. I believe Queen Mystic and the Moses Ascetic Order will support her and be able to ensure nothing goes wrong. Besides, the Church of Mother Earth has a bunch of saints, angels, and Grade 0 sealed artifacts, as well as a true deity. There's nothing they can't handle. As Klein consoled himself, he placed his attention onto the Mentor of Confusion and Ocean Songster Beyonder characteristics. His initial plan for the latter was to create a mystical item, but he wasn't sure if the artisan that the Hanged Man knew had the ability to do so. As for the former, he planned on selling it. Although it could also be made into an item, it overlapped with the Baron of Corruption inside the glove. Besides, Klein also began to realize that having too many mystical items wasn't necessarily a good thing. Particular negative effects were a pain when stacked. With creeping hunger and the rentable Laymanos travels, he believed that it was best if he traveled light most of the time. Under normal circumstances, creeping hunger matched with death knell, along with a few purifying bullets, it was enough to deal with most matters. When in a sea or air battle, he could have an additional mystical item made from an ocean songster. In complicated situations, he could rent Lamino's travels when given the opportunity. If there wasn't an opportunity, he could use Grozel's travels for defense, and throw out the Fate Siphon charm. And this wasn't considering his own Beyonder powers, Wraith Marionette, or the hard-to-use Sea God Scepter. In terms of fixed assets, I'm considered a true tycoon. Klein sighed as he made the Beyonder characteristics fly to the junk pile. As for the eyeball of the six-winged gargoyle, this was a material rich in spirituality and had some hint of strangeness. It could be used in a ritual to create charms. Klein temporarily had no better use or requirements for it, so he had already thrown it into the junk pile. After doing all of this, he disappeared from above the gray fog, and he returned to the real world. On Saturday morning, Furs had originally planned on waking up naturally, but she ended up being awoken by the world's transmission via Mr. Fool. He was returning Lamino's travels to her. Furs rubbed her eyes and planned on directly preparing the ritual, but when she saw her messy hair and puffy eyes, she decided to wash up first to make herself look human. She had finally sold the 2 properties yesterday, selling them at a higher price than she had expected. Even after deducting the corresponding taxes, she had received £6,550. To her chagrin, gold coins which were used in daily life may appear common, but when she attempted to collect them en masse, she failed to obtain much. After plenty of work, all she got was 600 gold coins. Phew, I can finally repay the debt and complete the transaction. Furs combed her hair and began setting up the ritual. Last night, to celebrate her first time accumulating such immense wealth, she secretly drank half a bottle of Lanty and a barrel of Southville beer. This resulted in her waking up in a terrible state. During the ritual, and after some communication, Furs paid £5,200 and 600 gold coins, closing the assassination commission and receiving an interrogator Beyonder characteristic. This way, she still had £2,530 in cash. As for the royalties from her 2 books, although they weren't much, they were relatively stable. After a brief wait, Furs saw the door of sacrifice and bestowment light up as 2 items flew out. One of them was Lamino's travels, and the other was a light blue, translucent hexagonal prism. In it were streaking bolts of lightning. Mr. World sure has many Beyonder characteristics on hand. Furs sighed silently and first thanked Mr. Fool before ending the ritual to accept the interrogator's Beyonder characteristic. Finally, she picked up Lamino's travels and flipped through it to see what additional Beyonder powers there were. As the pages flipped over, her gaze suddenly froze. This was because 2 of the charred yellow pages weren't empty. They were filled with mysterious and strange patterns and symbols. These represented Beyonder powers at the demigod level. A total of 2 pages. How extravagant, Furs couldn't help herself as she muttered. This was the first time she was seeing a demigod Beyonder power which she could freely use. As a best-selling author who mainly wrote romance, her first reaction was that the World Gehrman Sparrow was chasing after her. But thinking back to how they hadn't met before, and how the gentleman was a cold and powerful assassin, she quickly rejected such a guess. She believed that the World Gehrman Sparrow was probably able to receive help from a demigod at any time, so he didn't mind such matters. Phew, I should try not to use it. I'll let Mr. World use it when he rents it again. Furs exhaled with some fear, completely lacking the guts to take advantage of the terrifying assassin. After composing herself, she used her crystal ball and identified all the new Beyonder powers. She felt that they were all relatively useful apart from Full Moon. If I wish to commit suicide, this is quite a useful one, she muttered and closed Lamino's travels. She planned on giving Zio the interrogator's Beyonder characteristic when she returned in the evening. At 7 in the evening, Klein wore starched clothes as he waited at the foyer with butler Walter and valet Richardson to welcome the guests at his ball. Soon, he saw a familiar face walk over. Aaron Series. This famous surgeon walked to the main door while helping his pregnant wife. Pregnant lady. Klein's heart stirred as he walked over with a beaming smile. Chapter 8:17, Guests. As a polite gentleman, Klein obviously wouldn't stare at Aaron's wife. He looked at the famous surgeon and said, "Good evening, Aaron. How may I address your lovely companion?" Aaron's cold demeanor hadn't changed, but it didn't stop him from handing over an intricately packed bottle of red wine and say with a polite smile, "My wife, Wilma Gladys, a middle school teacher. It appears you are about to become a father again. When's it due?" Klein received the present and asked. The topic he had planned to cover when talking to Dr. Aaron had been about a few new surgery techniques in the papers, but he never expected him to bring his pregnant wife. This was a pleasant surprise for him. This was because Ma'am Wilma Gladys was expecting the unborn snake of Mercury, Wuxia. Aaron subconsciously glanced at his wife's tummy and said with a smile, "Early July. If you don't mind, I wish to invite you to his birth party." Just as he said that, the gentle and beautiful black-haired lady, Wilma, suddenly held her tummy and exclaimed in pain. "What happened?" Aaron asked in concern. "He kicked me, but he's calmed down," Wilma said with an eased expression. She then looked at Dwayne Dantes and smiled. "Because of my pregnancy, I've been home all the time and haven't been to such balls in a while. Feeling pent up at home, I got Aaron to bring me along. Although I can't dance, I'll be able to chat with the other ladies, and I'll even find some time to play some cards." "Your presence honors me," Klein sincerely replied. "I will come for his birth party in early July." He wasn't affected by the tiny accident, as he still remembered Dr. Aaron's invitation. After exchanging a few words of pleasantries, Klein handed over the gift to his valet, Richardson, and got him to lead his three guests into the hall. Without needing to wait too long, he received his second guest. It was Bishop Electra, who was still wearing his black clergyman robe, and his female partner. His partner was a lady in her early 20s who still had a little bit of baby fat to her cheeks. She looked at everything with a sense of wonder, and she was filled with energy. However, she had an additional hint of maturity to her due to her already having a child. "Good evening, Your Excellency. My sleep has recently been excellent," Klein said, feigning ignorance of the Church of Evernight's secret efforts. Electra immediately tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "This is a blessing of the goddess." He then introduced his female partner. "She's my wife, Shona Johnson." As he often visited Dwayne Dantes and had been to his residence several times, he didn't need to prepare any gifts for the ball. It would appear overly polite and too distant. "Nice to meet you. You are a lot younger than I imagined," Klein greeted Shona half politely and half jokingly with a nod. Meanwhile, he silently did the math. It said that the bishop got married 2 years ago. That means that his wife was only 18 or 19. This age difference is quite huge. In a few years, I might have to introduce a particular chubby apothecary to him. Upon hearing Dwayne Dantes's joke, and recalling the conversation back when he visited him while the former was sick, Electra immediately felt uneasy. He coughed gently and replied, "She's someone who likes a bustle. If she's free, she has no wish to miss any ball." Klein didn't speak further because he saw Ma'am Mary alight from her carriage and was walking over. After letting Bishop Electra and his wife enter the hall, Klein smiled at Mary and said, "Ma'am, perhaps we will be fellow workers next week." The lawyer and accounting team he hired had completed their investigations and had cleared the coin company's audit and said that it was very suitable for investing into. Furthermore, he had already reached a preliminary agreement with the gentleman who was selling the shares. Final confirmation of the sale of 3% shares for £12,800 was to be made next week. When Mary heard that, she chuckled and said, "I already treat you as a partner. This seems to have a deeper meaning to it." Don't tell me that Dwayne Dantes has caught your fancy. Klein's heart stirred as he feigned ignorance and reached his hand out. I hope for a pleasant partnership. After a shake of hands, he got butler Walter to lead the lady in. At this moment, more and more guests were arriving. Klein recalled the corresponding topics and warmly and humorously received them, receiving plenty of gifts as a result. If not for my instinctive ability as a faceless to remember a person's looks and characteristics, I wouldn't be able to tell who is who, much less find the correct topic to raise. It's no wonder that a butler's help is often needed at such times. As Klein was stirring in poignancy, he saw Member of Parliament Mocht and his family arrive. He smiled again and took a step forward. Good evening. Today's starry sky is especially beautiful. Member of Parliament Mocht smiled as he handed a bottle of Black Rand from some unknown vineyard to him and said, I've been in Backland for nearly 20 years, but the number of starry skies I've seen combined cannot even compare to the number I've seen this year. I hope there will be more with time. Klein then said to Ma'am Rihanna, I heard that the both of you have gotten a boarding school for Miss Hazel? Rihanna looked at her daughter who wore a cold expression despite maintaining a polite smile. Boarding school education is becoming increasingly popular. It's the same for females. And most importantly, perhaps Hazel will get to know more friends. Unfortunately, she doesn't seem too happy about this arrangement, as she can't bear to leave us. In Backland, boarding schools that targeted females of high society had already grown in popularity. The education they provided might not be better than home tutors, but it created a social circle. The school fees for such a boarding school like that was about £500 a year. She probably can't bear to part with the sewers here. Klein lampooned. After a short chat, he let Member of Parliament Mocht and family into the hall. When it was almost time, he didn't wait by the door and instead walked to the second floor. Standing behind the railing that faced the main door, he gestured for the musicians to pause the music. Holding a cup of champagne, Klein surveyed the surroundings. With all the guests looking at him, he loudly said, I'm very happy that all of you can grace this ball with your presence. First, I'd like to thank the goddess, as well as you. I've prepared for everyone local music and food from Desi, and I hope you will like it. After a simple speech, Klein walked down the stairs to the first floor, in preparation to invite a lady to dance the opening dance. Typically, a married host would definitely invite his own partner for the opening dance, while unmarried men or women would dance with a relative of the opposite sex, or invite someone they had their eye on, in an alternate form of a blind date. But Dwayne Dantes didn't have any family or any suitable target, so this matter appeared somewhat embarrassing. However, he had an experienced butler. His butler had hired a socialite of high society, and although dancing the opening dance would result in some rumors, it wouldn't make others believe that they were dating. Therefore, Klein looked at the lady named Aurea without any guilt as he walked towards her. This lady was a widow who had good relationships with several people in Backland's high society. She enjoyed quite a status in this circle, but of course, she wasn't well liked by the ladies. Anyone with a bit of standing looked down on her. Regardless, Aurea's female charms and her bearing was excellent. It was especially so with her figure that had alluring curves. If it wasn't because her looks were only above average, Klein would have suspected that she was a demoness. Ma'am, may I have the pleasure of dancing with you? Klein followed the teachings of his etiquette teacher, Wiana, and posed flawlessly. Aurea with her blonde hair bun smiled and reached out her hand. You are a gentleman that cannot be rejected, that sounds ambiguous. Her identity and the role she plays in social settings ensures that she can't act as demure as most ladies and madams. Klein held her hand, entered the dance floor, and began dancing under the tune of a village folk song. The aristocrats all had land, manors, and castles in the villages, and they spent several months a year there. Therefore, folk songs were one of the mainstream songs in high society social events. You dance really well. If Wiana hadn't mentioned it before, I wouldn't believe that you weren't able to dance before. Aurea deliberately leaned in close. As they moved in step, her breathing could be heard. As she was a stranger, Klein was a little uneasy by the close distance, but he couldn't push her away while under everyone's gaze, so all he could do was smile. I just didn't know how to dance such dances. In fact, I'm good at the kind of dances from Desi Bay and the southern continent where there's greater freedom. I also like those kinds of dances. They are full of strength and passion. It's danced for yourself and not for others. Aurea found a topic as she gyrated her body, appearing extremely intimate with Dwayne Dantes. Towards the end of the opening dance, she said with a suppressed chuckle, "If it wasn't for the rumors, I would even suspect that you don't fancy women because you're a little stiff. However, I no longer have any doubts." As she spoke, she glanced down. Klein was actually rather embarrassed. She was really good at using her body and words to create a suggestive atmosphere. However, Dwayne Dantes was an experienced man and couldn't admit defeat. He smiled with a natural expression. Stiffness is a result of not being used to Backlund's social scene. "I can teach you," Aurea said with a chuckle. At that moment, the tune came to an end as she took a step back and winked with a smile. "You're really passionate." The words were a double entendre that left Klein nearly blushing. He even began to suspect if she was related to demonesses. He continued wearing a stoic expression as he bent his back into a bow, and he sent Aurea back to her spot. Through the corner of his eye, he caught Wilma Gladys, who was pregnant with the snake of Mercury, walking towards the long table to the side. Her target was apparently the first batch of ice cream. Chapter 8:18, Warning. Klein's gaze moved away from Wilma Gladys and looked to the pastries like carrot cake and cream puffs to the side, as well as the roasted poussin, stewed lamb, seared ribeye, Desi roasted fish, and the other food nearby. He gulped his saliva slightly and forced himself to retract his gaze as he prepared to invite Ma'am Mary for the second dance. As the host, he couldn't skip any of the first 3 dances, therefore, all he could do was temporarily forget his hunger and the delicacies. And at this moment, Wilma Gladys, whose pregnant state showed, walked to the spot where there was ice cream. She reached out her hand before retracting it. "You want some?" Dr. Aaron hadn't joined the first dance as he stayed by his pregnant wife's side. Wilma Gladys sternly shook her head. "No, I don't. I'm pregnant. It's not good to have ice cream. However, the little fella in my tummy seems to want a little, just a little." Dr. Aaron nodded indiscernibly and said, "Then have some. Leave the rest to me." Wilma immediately revealed an irresistible smile. "You spoil him too much." She didn't object to it as she watched her husband pick up a scoop of ice cream that had been circled with ice. After taking 2 bites, Wilma closed her eyes and suddenly shifted her gaze. She looked at a few ladies who hadn't participated in the first dance. They were chatting about something in hushed tones. They had smiles across their suggestive faces, often covering their mouths and laughing covertly. What interesting matters are they talking about? Wilma's curiosity was instantly piqued, and after informing her husband, Aaron, she walked over. However, the few ladies quickly dispersed as though they were awaiting the second dance. Wilma was disappointed as she asked the young beautiful lady who remained standing there, "Do you know what they were discussing about?" "I'm not interested in their topics," Hazel said as she glanced at the pregnant lady beside her. She didn't fault her for being a little impolite because pregnant ladies often had some privileges. Only then did Wilma notice that Hazel, with her long black-green hair, was holding a cup of champagne. She looked like she had no wish to be invited to a dance. She has a sense of pride that stems from the bottom of her heart. Even when looking at Baronet madams, she will only maintain the most basic courtesy. This is a delightful character, but the problem is that she's like that to everyone. She's overly cold and aloof. Perhaps, she's in the rebellious stage that Emperor Roselle had mentioned before? As a middle school teacher, Wilma couldn't help but make comment inwardly. Then, knowing better, she opened up a distance from Hazel and began looking for the ladies she was familiar with. After completing 3 dances, Klein finally had a brief reprieve to stuff himself with more food and drink some thirst-quenching sweet iced tea. This was a D's specialty that he specially got the kitchen to prepare. Due to the influence of Death Knell, he had drank a little too much. After having a short conversation with Bishop Electra, he had to apologize and take his leave to the washroom. In fact, he could hold back for another 3 more dances. However, he felt that Snake of Fate Wuxia might have wanted to communicate with him, judging from his sudden appearance. Therefore, he found a suitable place without anyone around. Although he is an unborn fetus and came here passively, if he doesn't wish to meet me, he has 100 ways to stop his mother from heading out. In short, it's worth giving it a try. Klein mumbled as he entered the washroom and locked the door. Just as he was in a dilemma to deal with his burgeoning bladder or patiently wait another 2 minutes, his spiritual perception triggered as he looked at the mirror. At some point in time, the mirror had produced a black pram that was covered in shadows that prevented him from seeing any details. The only thing he could discern was that there was a child wrapped in silver silk inside. The child used a clear voice and said, "Your fate deviated a little." What happened? Klein tensed up immediately. Wuxia in his infant form scoffed and said, "You should ask yourself. All I know is that you likely met an angel." Klein immediately recalled his experiences on the primitive island and had a guess. After contemplating for a few seconds, he asked with a frown, "Can angels see my uniqueness?" "I've met Orange Light, and he said that only a few high-level creatures of the spirit world, as well as deities with certain unique authorities or beyonder who represent fate can discover this point to a certain extent. Of course, close contact has to be made." In the pram, Wuxia sucked at his thumb and laughed. "Probably not, because you aren't dangerous. Besides, apart from you being unique, some items on you or your companion might have a similar uniqueness that can garner the interest of that person." Items on me, my companions. Klein's mind raced as he discovered that he might have been psychologically cued in the past, and along with the fact that he hadn't thought of it, he had missed out something. When exploring the primitive island, he had brought Grozel's travels along. This was a book created by an ancient god, the Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt. If that primitive island is related to the Twilight Hermit Order, be it the Angel of the Spectator pathway deep inside the cathedral with a high-sequence ingredient of the Storm pathway, or the opposite, he will likely be interested in the notebook. After all, the leader of the organization is the Angel of Imagination, the son of God, Adam. And it's because of this notebook that I was allowed to take away the Tyrant card while also preventing me and Mr. Hanged Man from continuing the exploration? Klein had a hunch as he asked, "How should I resolve this?" "There's no need. In the long term, this should be something good, but there might be some trouble midway," Wuxia replied with a clear voice. "Furthermore, you are already burdened with so many matters. An additional matter wouldn't matter. I warned you so that you can take note so as to not be struck by trouble, makes sense. One stops worrying when there are too many debts. Perhaps it might create opportunities and let my debtors end up fighting." On careful thought, Klein echoed inwardly. He asked instead, "My friend who wishes to obtain a drop of a mythical creature's blood wishes to know exactly what you need." "What do I need?" Wuxia scoffed once again. "There's plenty I need. For example, the means to accommodate the die of probability, or how to finish off Ouroboros. If it's possible, you can take as many vials of blood as you want. But, can it be done? If it's possible, why take the risk to finish off Ouroboros? Wouldn't it be easier to just deal with a weak snake of fate like you?" As Klein lampooned, he shook his head without a doubt. "No. Then think of something else. I'm not in a rush." Wuxia paused and said, "There's a very arrogant lady at the ball tonight. There's something wrong with her. If you have the chance to chat with her, you can lead the topic of conversation towards dreams. Hazel? Dreams? Klein nodded in thought. Okay. Seeing that Wuxia had the intention to leave, he hurriedly said, that paper crane is about to tear. How should I contact you in the future when I encounter an emergency? Wuxia fell silent for a moment before saying, Are you hoping that I can fold a paper crane for you in my mother's tummy? Even if I can, you won't be able to get it. If I have any desire to find you, and as long as you live here, I can do so at any time during dreams. If you have any emergency matters, just visit my father directly. After all, don't you have to wait when using the paper crane? Alright, as a fetus who hasn't been born, I need to have more sleep. Let's leave anything else to the future. All Klein could do was nod and say, if there's nothing else from you. Just as Wuxia was about to dissipate his body, he suddenly paused for 2 seconds and said, another thing. What is it? Klein tensed up once again. Wuxia dragged out his tone and said, the ice cream your cook made is too sweet, Klein temporarily didn't react to what he was saying until the black pram vanished from the mirror. He then snapped out of his daze and couldn't help but twitch the corners of his lips. After settling the problem with his burgeoning bladder, he washed his hands and came out. He found Richardson and instructed, go to the kitchen and get them to lower the sweetness of the ice cream that is subsequently being made. Richardson didn't ask why, and he immediately did as he was told. Only when he was about to enter the kitchen did he recall the problem. Mr. Dwayne Dantes hasn't touched the ice cream yet, so how did he know that it's a little too sweet? Towards this problem, Richardson quickly had an answer. He believed that a guest had informed his employer after sampling the ice cream. Although it was a little impolite, it wasn't something rare, especially among familiar friends. They would proactively and kindly inform him so as to prevent the host of the ball from suffering unpleasant critique. At this moment, as the previous dance was still happening, Klein wasn't in a hurry to consider a dance partner. He walked to the long table by the side and seized the opportunity to have some of the delicacies. Just as he selected a piece of Desi roasted fish without many bones, he suddenly saw Wilma Gladys lean over and pick up a cup of sweet iced tea. The lady nodded at the host and smiled. This beverage is nice. I've never had it before. It's sweet iced tea from the south, Klein explained with a smile as he casually glanced at her tummy. He seems to be very obedient. Oh, perhaps, it's a she. Wilma smiled. Most of the time, but there might be some stirrings in the middle of the night at times. Middle of the night. At times. Don't tell me it's when he's replying to my questions. Klein suddenly broke out into a sweat as he feigned ignorance and cast his attention back onto his plate. As Wilma drank a sip of sweet iced tea, she headed back to her previous conversation. When the new dance began, Klein handed his plate and cup to an attendant beside him and glanced at Hazel. He slowly walked over and bowed with a smile. Lady, may I have the pleasure of dancing with you? Hazel fell silent for a few seconds and placed the cup of champagne onto an attendant's tray and replied politely, it will be my pleasure. Chapter 8:19, Gift. Amidst a soothing melody, Klein and Hazel began dancing with their backs straight. One was tall and slim, and apart from the clear difference in age, their movements, demeanor, and looks were highly compatible. It was a beautiful sight to behold, one that could almost be used as a prime example for dancing. Klein took the initiative to break the silence. As they twirled, he casually said, I often had nightmares some time ago, but thankfully I had the goddess's blessings. I prayed a few times at the cathedral and drank a few cups of holy water, and after that, I stopped jolting awake. Hazel silently looked up and, after 2 seconds, asked, what kind of nightmare? To think you will be interested in such a topic. Wuxia was right after all. Klein replied with a smile, I was being pursued by all kinds of monsters inside an abandoned, dilapidated cathedral. But you probably know, it's almost impossible to remember the details in a dream. I find it difficult to describe those monsters. Hazel didn't say a word, but her bright, brown eyes were colored with dissent. That also meant that she believed that dreams weren't necessarily impossible to recall. Klein took a step diagonally with her in his arms as he said with a smile, "Indeed, I've had a very clear dream in the past. Back then, I was still in the southern continent. I dreamed of an inverted mausoleum. It was constructed from pitch-black stone columns that extended underground. There were zombies covered in white feathers that appeared from them in a bid to pull me in. I had such dreams for several days, and it's really quite embarrassing. I was very afraid back then, so I frantically went to a nearby city and found a divination club. I got them to interpret my dream, and I received the conclusion that during one of my purchases of local goods, I had offended the faith of a tribe that believed in death. Strangely, when I went to the tribe to apologize, gave them gifts, and participated in their celebrations, I never had that dream again." He had fabricated the story from his experience as a seer. His goal was to pique Hazel's interest to see if she would unknowingly reveal something. At the same time, this was a suggestion with a deeper meaning, one that wouldn't garner suspicion. The deeper meaning was that Hazel could find a divination club member or a cathedral's priest to interpret her dream if she was troubled by it. It was best not to make rash choices while blindly believing the contents of the dream. When Wuxia mentioned that there was something wrong with Hazel and suggested chatting about dreams, Klein suspected that her dilemma stemmed from a dream that kept happening. Otherwise, it was hard to explain how, despite being at least a sequence 8, she had a severe lack of knowledge towards the mysterious world with her blind arrogance. Furthermore, she was a lady from high society who had been educated at home. Thus, it made it difficult for her to make contact with unaffiliated beyonders or those without clear intentions. After all, her father was a member of parliament who was definitely protected. She likely had no lack of beyonders around her. Therefore, Klein believed that Hazel might have made contact with something or had caught the fancy of some powerful beyonder due to her personality. Through dreams, she was slowly guided to become a beyonder, without giving her the necessary knowledge. At the same time, the entity enticed her to dig in the sewers to search for something. There were two reasons that solidified his theory. Firstly, it was because of Wuxia's words. Secondly, Sequence 5 of the Marauder pathway was Dream Stealer. It was impossible that it only had the one beyonder power of stealing the intent behind an action. Hazel quietly listened to Dwayne Dantes' description as her mouth subconsciously gaped before closing again. After nearly 10 seconds, she asked, "Why didn't you head to the goddess's cathedral?" As expected, she's reacting to topics about dreams. However, she's quite careful and doesn't divulge anything. Klein smiled wryly and said, there weren't any cathedrals of the goddess around. It was a region that held faith in the god of steam and machinery. Hazel didn't continue the topic as she focused her attention back onto the dance, as though she was fully immersed in the music. Klein also quietened down as he swirled around in the beautiful melody with the girl. After the dance, he sent Hazel back to where she was standing, and then he headed for the long table due to his thirst, hoping to get a cup of sweet iced tea. At this moment, he saw Bishop Electra enjoying some red wine over there. Unlike the Church of Storms and the Church of the God of Combat, clergymen of the Evernight Goddess were prohibited from excessive drinking. They needed to reject distilled spirits, and they could only drink champagne, beer, and red and white grape wine in moderation. How is it? This should be your first time holding such a grand ball, right? Electra smiled as he raised his cup. Klein smiled and replied, very troublesome, and it's also, The biggest problem is that having so many dances in a row is exhausting. I kept sweating and wanted to drink more water. Bishop Electra chuckled and said, when you're here in Backlund, don't slack on any physical exercise. At times, the social scene is more tiring than you can imagine. With that said, he said with a jibing smile, Ma'am Aurea has endorsed you, believing that your character matches your appearance. I'd like to thank her for her endorsement." Klein was momentarily unable to find the words to reply with as he replied in a jokingly manner, "A person's character cannot be identified from a single dance." Without waiting for Electra to reveal a smile that all men understood, he switched to saying, "Your Excellency, I've recently involved myself in some business, and I'm afraid that I might offend a gentleman in power. I'm a little worried." He was referring to the Coin Company and Baron Sindras. Electra took a sip of red wine and said, "Don't worry. Backlund follows the rule of law. Besides, the goddess will bless you. That's relieving. Praise the lady." Klein seriously drew the crimson moon on his chest. After Electra headed for the dance floor, his gaze darkened as he sighed silently. He wasn't feeling fearful or hatred. He just felt a slight guilty conscience. Up to this point in time, the Church of Evernight had been good to him. Although money was the reason, they had provided him plenty of help to the point of providing him some protection. Yet, he was planning to deal with the keepers, as well as contemplating how to steal something from the core seal behind Cheney's gate. Sigh, if this plan takes too long to complete, I'd really need periodic psychological treatment. Otherwise, I'll have some mental problems. Klein monitored his emotions as he shook his head indiscernibly. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Zio came home with Potter pies and Desi Bay sweet iced tea. As she put it on the dining table, she said to Furs, "Don't eat too much of such food. It's unhealthy." "Why do you say that?" Furs picked up a pie stuffed with fruits and ham before taking a bite. "I read about it in a magazine. As a bounty hunter, maintaining one's figure is a necessity." Zio hesitated for a moment before pulling a pie to her mouth. Furs scoffed. "You're a beyonder geared for combat, an extraordinary bounty hunter. There's no need to bother about maintaining your figure. Perhaps, you might have missed out on your final opportunity to grow taller as a result." "Oh right, I heard that the warrior pathway has an effective way of raising a person's height. It's obvious just from looking at those barbarians from Faysac." Zio was taken aback as she suddenly sighed. "But I was born as a half-arbiter. I have no way of becoming a warrior." Clearly, she had seriously considered it in the past. Realizing that she had triggered her friend's memories, she acted as though she hadn't said a word as she focused on having her late dinner. After they were done eating and clearing up, Furs pulled Zio into her bedroom and cleared her throat. "You've helped me tremendously, so I plan on giving you a present. What troublesome matter do you need help with this time?" Zio touched her short, blonde hair warily. Furs blinked as she suddenly reflected on her recent behavior. She chuckled dryly and said, "This is for the past, the past." Without waiting for Zio to reply, she took out a metal box under Zio's doubtful gaze, one that was used to store cigars. "I don't smoke," Zio said with a shake of her head. Furs tersely answered as she opened the box, revealing a translucent hexagonal pillar that was light blue in color. Zio's gaze froze as she looked at the luster that streaked inside the crystal-like lightning as she instinctively asked, "Interrogator?" Yes, a participant at a Beyonder gathering was selling it cheaply. "I was afraid of missing the opportunity and hurriedly bought it," Furs said the complete truth. "As you know, I've recently been rewarded by my teacher because of something just a while ago. I'm not lacking in cash." Zio knew that her friend had been out recently, claiming that she was doing something for her teacher. However, she found it unbelievable that she could so easily buy her an interrogator Beyonder characteristic as a gift. This was completely unlike her original lifestyle. Is she still gambling, having earned large sums of money after becoming an astrologer? Or did she finally cast her sights onto a bank vault and used her door-opening powers to rob the cash inside? Many guesses flashed through Zio's mind, but she wasn't able to find the corresponding proof. About 2 to 3 seconds later, she made a decision. She was to randomly pretend to head out 2 days a week, and she would secretly observe what Furs was doing. If it wasn't for her trust in her friend's character and bottom line, she would have suspected that she had become the mistress of a powerful beyonder or tycoon. It's too valuable. Xiao waved her hand, in an attempt to reject the gift. Furs had already thought of the excuse as she said with a smile, I'll have matters to trouble you with in the future. Just treat it as an advanced payment. We are good friends. There's no need to talk about payment. Xiao hesitated for a second as she said with a shake of her head. I was waiting for you to say that. Furs immediately smiled and said, then treat it as an early birthday present. Don't you reject it. But my birthday is more than half a year away. As Xiao muttered, she eventually reached out and took the interrogator beyonder characteristic. Sunday afternoon. Xiao repressed her excitement and anticipation as she headed out as per normal. She planned on heading to a specific spot to leave a corresponding mark to schedule a meeting with the masked man from MI9 at some secluded alley. After obtaining the interrogator's beyonder characteristic and having digested her sheriff potion, all she needed was the correct formula to advance to Sequence 7. It would be a crucial step for her investigation of the truth and restoring her family's honor. Therefore, she was eager to receive a few more missions from the military to accumulate the amount of contributions she needed. After doing all of this, she planned on circling East Borough first to see if there was any important news. Then, she planned on returning home to tail Furs, so that she could figure out what her good friend was up to, or if she was in any danger. However, the moment she entered East Borough, she had a hunch that someone was staring at her. Chapter 820, Two Dazed Instances. Who is it? As a sheriff, Xiao had a sharp intuition for monitoring others and for being monitored by others. Her heart tensed up as her mind raced to consider what had just happened. In the past 2 to 3 weeks, she hadn't encountered anything particularly noteworthy. The few criminals she apprehended weren't beyonders, and they were, at best, related to certain gangs. No one would offend a famous bounty hunter in East Borough for them. Therefore, she quickly narrowed down the list of suspects, and she vaguely guessed at the spy's faction. A member from the Aurora Order? I didn't attend Mr. X's gathering, and an accident happened. Apparently, it was quite a stunning scene. The person from MI9 said that Mr. X was assassinated on the spot, and had his corpse taken away. Furthermore, the assassin had used powers at the demigod level. Is the Aurora Order investigating the possible culprits? Every invitee is in their sights? Although Xiao was careless and short-tempered at times, her thought process was relatively direct. But in similar fields, she had a strong intuition that allowed her to figure out the crux of the matter. And on the matter regarding Mr. X's assassination, she had once been thankful that Furs had stopped her from attending, thus, avoiding the accident. On the other hand, she felt that there wasn't anything wrong about her, allowing her to stand up to the scrutiny of any investigation. Therefore, when she met the masked man from MI9 last week, she had been frank and confident, and she had accepted the mission to investigate the truth behind the matter. Unfortunately, she wasn't sure which other beyonders had participated back then, and she had no clues to kick her off. That man from MI9 said that the members of Aurora Order are either lunatics or potential lunatics. You can't use common sense to guess at their actions. Even if they believe that there's nothing wrong with me, they can kill me in passing to vent their anger as a warning to the real murderer. The stressed Xiao walked forward as she revised her path in East Borough. This new route allowed her to obtain the help of friends at any time. If she suffered an ambush, there was a considerable chance that she could escape or kill the assailant. As she walked, Xiao's mind suddenly went into a daze, as she realized that she had unknowingly arrived back at her residence in Sherwood Borough at some point in time. Xiao entered blankly and drank a cup of water when she was patted on the shoulder by Furs. Accompany me to East Borough. Xiao was taken aback as she found herself saying something very familiar. You want to head out to gather material? Furs immediately said that it wasn't the case, indicating that she had previously accepted a mission to find the dust left behind after a ghost faded away. As the deceased had been given a send-off by the priests at the cemetery to their respective deities' kingdom, there wasn't any ghosts. Thus, they could only head over to East Borough to find targets. Xiao hesitated and said, "Can't you push it back a day? I'm planning to participate in Mr. X's gathering." Furs immediately wore a bitter look and said that she had delayed it by too much, and the mission's deadline was looming. Xiao sighed and agreed to accompany her friend to East Borough to find a deceased person that had just died or one that hadn't been discovered after a period of time since their death. Just as the two were about to exit, Xiao felt the wind strike her in the face as she trembled and snapped awake. She saw a wandering poet sitting in a corner, playing a 7-string guitar as he sang a folk song that was famous in the southern villages. Xiao frowned slightly as she rubbed her temples. She had a nagging feeling that her mind had gone adrift, but she couldn't remember what she was thinking about. She continued maintaining her vigilance as she followed her originally set route, entering a bar that sold lunch. On the way, she met an East Borough resident who would occasionally provide her with intelligence. He was a man who was either 23 or 24 years old. He had thinned his brows, and his brown hair reached his shoulders. His facial features were rather soft, and he had put on cheap makeup. He gave off quite an odd vibe. "Sherman, did anything happen in the past few days?" Xiao greeted. According to what she knew, this young man named Sherman had always thought of himself as a woman. However, fate had played a terrible joke on him, making him a man. This made him suffer serious levels of ostracization for many years. Sherman grinned and said, "It's been peaceful. No man offered to buy me any drinks." "Drinking is bad," Xiao advised him seriously, walked past him, and walked to the bar counter. Sherman spat as he walked to the entrance, swaying his hips until he arrived at the condominium he rented. He paused at the door for nearly a minute before walking 2 steps to the side and knocking on the door next door. The wooden door creaked open as a low, female voice sounded with an undeniable sweetness to it. "Have you made your decision?" Sherman walked in and closed the door behind him. Looking towards the bed, he said to the black-dressed lady, "I'm still doubtful. I don't believe that there's something as magical as that." To him, the lady had a round face and a gentle and refined temperament. Not only was she sweet-looking, but she also had a different air to her. She was extremely charming and alluring. Of course, to Sherman, he was more envious instead of smitten. The black-dressed lady replied with a deadpan expression, "Haven't you seen the picture of my former appearance?" Her gaze moved as she couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. "But that might have been your twin brother." "I find it difficult to believe that there really is a substance to change me into a woman," Sherman said in a wavering tone. The black-dressed lady chuckled without any humor in it. "Then, you can pretend that it's fake. You may leave." Sherman's hands tightened as he fell silent for a long while. I am willing to give it a try. Although I know that you might be bluffing me, I still wish to give it a try." "Then, what should be the price I need to pay?" "Listen to my instructions, and help me do certain tasks." "Don't worry. They will definitely be things you are capable of," the black-dressed lady said. "To truly change your sex, you need to drink 3 potions and complete certain rituals. I'll guide you." Upon saying this, she said in a self-deprecating manner, "You can consider your female name." At night, in the Backland Bridge area, in a small alley at Iron Gate Street, Xiao stood under a street lamp that had been shattered by someone. She was recounting what had happened in the morning. After confirming that she wasn't being tailed, she returned to Cherwood Borough and secretly observed Furs. She discovered that her friend didn't head out at all, staying at home like she usually did. She spent most of her time reading novels, newspapers, and magazines. She also drew the curtains in her room for nearly an hour, as though she was familiarizing herself with her beyonder powers. Until she had nothing to do, she got a piece of paper and spent 15 minutes writing the opening to her new book. Finally, she tore it apart, crumbled it into a ball, and threw it into the trash can. She smokes and drinks excessively. Xiao silently clenched her teeth when she saw a figure in a black suit walking out of the shadows from the other end of the alley. The man was tall and wore a golden mask that revealed his eyes, nostrils, mouth, and cheeks. He was none other than the MI9 member who was in contact with Xiao. "Is there anything urgent?" he asked directly. Although Xiao was short, she said in a similarly domineering manner, "I was tailed in East Borough. I suspect that it's someone from the Aurora Order. They seem to be investigating what happened during the gathering." The topic Xiao had prepared to talk about was about someone she was asked to look for. She planned on using a clue that couldn't be confirmed, to make a request for the emergency meeting to appear normal. However, she now had a more suitable excuse thanks to the Aurora Order. The lunatics from the Aurora Order are like that. Although they know that we're also investigating the matter and are finding them, they don't shrink back. If it's not because of that, they wouldn't always be suffering setbacks, the golden-masked man said with a laugh. To be frank, I'm very surprised that they didn't directly surround you and bring you to a secluded place to interrogate and channel your spirit. Xiao was about to answer him that the Aurora Order member didn't tail her for long when she suddenly recalled the dazed feeling she found inexplicable. Hence, she deliberated and mentioned, "I'm not sure what I encountered. For a very brief period of time, I seemed to be in a daze and can't remember what I recalled." The golden-masked man fell silent. After nearly 20 seconds, he said, "The investigation pertaining to you should have ended. The importance the Aurora Order has placed on this matter has exceeded my imagination. I will report this matter." You mentioned that many Beyonders received the invitation but didn't attend?" Xiao nodded and said, "The participants of each gathering doesn't exceed a third of the number of people invited. This is mostly normal for a gathering. It's not an exception for Mr. X's gathering either." The golden-masked man considered for a moment before asking, "Are there any clues about the person I got you to search for? The person whose original name was Trissy?" Xiao shook her head after seeing him nod. "Not yet. She's likely experienced." The golden-masked man immediately chuckled. "The number of people she has killed is more than the number of bounty missions you have completed. If you have any clues, make sure not to approach her. She's highly dangerous." Xiao tersely answered and focused on the main topic at hand. "Is there a new commission? Why have you suddenly become so proactive?" the golden-masked man asked in surprise. Xiao frankly replied, "I'm almost about to save up enough points to exchange for the interrogator potion formula. I wish to obtain it early." "Actually, there's no need for that. You can directly exchange it for the potion, as it will save quite a bit of points," the golden-masked man suggested in Xiao's behalf. "I already have the Beyonder characteristic." Xiao shook her head and said, "That would still take a very long time. I might be able to buy the ingredients at other Beyonder gatherings." The golden-masked man didn't insist as he said with a laughing sigh, "I wish you luck. This time, it's a rather complicated commission. If you can complete it, you should have enough points." Xiao held back her delight and asked, "What's the mission?" The masked man said with a slightly odd tone, "Take note of the people Viscount Stratford interacts with, and list them down in a report before submitting it to me. There's no need for you to frequently monitor him. Whenever you are free or walk past, take note of it in passing. Trust me, you aren't the only one working on this mission. As long as you hand over a report of certain value a week, it'll be considered as you contributing a certain amount. This can be repeated every week. Viscount Stratford." Xiao suddenly fell into a daze again, but this time, she knew why. This Viscount was the captain of the Royal Guards. He was once her father's deputy. Chapter 821, soul imprint Zio was dazed for about 10 seconds before remembering the need to reply. She looked at the golden-masked man and nodded. "All right, I'll take note of the people Viscount Stratford interacts with." The golden-masked man seemed to sense her dazed state as he said, "There's another mission. The Church of Evernights Red Gloves are investigating something related to the numinous episcopate. If you have any relevant information on that, immediately inform me." Zio tersely responded, unable to extricate herself from her emotions. The golden-masked man fell silent for a few seconds and asked after some deliberation, "Are you interested in directly joining MI9? You can continue maintaining your present identity, being active in East Borough." Zio was taken aback for 2 seconds as her mouth turned agape. She was momentarily unable to make a decision. The golden-masked man didn't require an immediate answer as he said with a smile, "There's no rush. Tell me your answer after you become an interrogator." After saying that, he walked back, step after step, slinking away into the shadows at the other end of the alley. That same evening, Klein snapped awake from a dream. The soul imprint he had set up in Buckland Street sewers had been touched. Who is it that isn't sleeping in the middle of the night? Is Hazel not afraid of being possessed by a wraith? Klein sighed helplessly as he took out the iron cigar case which was wrapped in a wall of spirituality from under his pillow. He then walked to the balcony where the curtains were tightly drawn. Wraith Senior rapidly leaped onto the surface of a street lamp before passing the manhole and sinking deep into the sewers. After advancing a short distance, with the eyes of his marionette, Klein saw Hazel in commoner clothes. This lady was warily walking forward as she raised her left hand without realizing it to touch the necklace with 7 emeralds. In her right hand was a charm made from gold. Although the charm hadn't been activated, it exuded the feeling of sunlight and warmth, as well as the refreshing sense of morning dew. Upon seeing this scene, Klein suddenly recalled his encounter when strolling in the morning. Hazel had woken up early to stroll in her garden. She was gathering materials to create the sun domain charm. Morning dew? Klein guessed with uncertainty as he felt a little puzzled. This was because Hazel wasn't only half illiterate in the mysterious domain, but she also lacked quite a bit of knowledge. Furthermore, she was a believer of the Evernight goddess. Such a beyonder wouldn't receive any response if she prayed to the eternal blazing Sunday. Even if something special happened, the smallest probability event would be that of receiving punishment. As she hasn't been digging and searching in the sewers for too long, that beyonder that has been guiding her with a dream has turned anxious. That's why she was taught how to make sun domain charms via a dream? From the Marauder pathway, the corresponding high-sequence representative, Amon, is also known as a blasphemer. Does this mean that at a certain sequence of this pathway, they have the ability to pretend to be believers of other deities and circle around any defenses to obtain a response and create various kinds of charms? This does match their modus operandi. With Senor's vision, Klein watched Hazel walk deep into the sewers. Based on his spiritual intuition, although the sun domain charm was targeted at a wraith, it was far from sufficient to truly threaten a sequence 5, with it dealing a certain amount of damage at best. After all, Hazel had no way of obtaining high-level materials. However, Klein didn't let his wraith possess her again, afraid that it would alarm that beyonder who was influencing Hazel. After tomorrow's tarot gathering, he believed he would obtain a low-level item from the Marauder pathway, allowing him to make the corresponding investigations. Before that, maintaining the status quo was the best choice. Of course, the premise was that he was certain that Hazel wasn't able to dig up anything within a day or two. He had plenty of time to prepare. As a seer, he had many ways to make a confirmation. The simplest way was to head above the gray fog. After retracting his marionette, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived inside the ancient palace which had stone columns propping it up. He conjured a pen and paper, and he wrote down the corresponding divination statement: something major will happen in Buckland Street over the next 3 days. With the topaz pendulum, Klein obtained a negative revelation. This also meant that in 3 days, no major incident would happen in Buckland Street. As for the possibility of what Hazel would really dig out, it would only affect him while being trivial to Buckland Street. He wasn't fazed. This was because something trivial wouldn't affect his subsequent plans. He didn't have any strong intentions of stopping her. He had previously given a hint to her at the ball. If Hazel didn't understand or didn't take it to heart, it was her problem. Klein didn't have any psychological burden on such matters. After returning to the real world, he waited for 45 minutes before Hazel came out. After confirming that no significant changes happened underground, Klein laid back in bed, and with cogitation, he quickly fell asleep. Monday afternoon at 3. Dark red beams of light that soared up from both sides of the long bronze table appeared before the fool Klein's, the son Derek's, and the world Gehrman Sparrow's eyes. Justice Audrey remained in a good mood as she bowed at the figure shrouded in grey fog. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool," Klein nodded with a smile as a response to this lady who often delighted him. Meanwhile, Audrey swept her gaze and discovered an additional card beside Mr. Fool's hand. A new card of blasphemy? I wonder which pathway it's from. I really wish that it's from the spectator pathway. Audrey's heart stirred as she turned to greet the other members. Once everything was done, she looked to the end of the model table ahead of the hermit Catlia and said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I've found 3 new pages of Roselle's diary." This was actually obtained from the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, but as its founder and main sponsor, she easily received the opportunity to make a copy. Audrey was rather proud in regards to this. She was increasingly convinced that establishing such a foundation was a wise decision of hers. Unfortunately, to not expose her identity, she didn't share this matter with the other members of the Tarot Club. Very good. Klein smiled with a nod, indicating that Miss Justice could conjure the diary. And at this moment, the hermit Catlia didn't interject, as though she hadn't obtained any new Roselle diary pages. There's temporarily no response from Queen Mystic? Or has she focused her attention on something else? Klein looked at the 3 diary pages which Miss Justice had conjured as he allowed them to jump into his palm. When he scanned them, the corners of Klein's lips nearly twitched. This was because he had encountered a familiar page of one of Roselle's sexual escapades. Compared to the pages specially chosen by Queen Mystic Bernadette that had plenty of information, the other members often obtained parts that weren't too important. The content tended to be about Roselle's daily life. The 3 pages that Miss Justice had provided was such an example. Klein casually flipped through them and discovered a diary entry that was worth a detailed read. As for the rest, it was either about him having a rendezvous with some lady or madam, or him belittling people who survived due to their status instead of intellect. He even expressed his desire for a demoness from all the rumors he heard. Soon, Klein placed his attention on the most valuable diary entry. Based on the information obtained from the church, there really are monsters in existence that are stitched at the soul level. After high-sequence Beyonders die, the Beyonder characteristics they produce will have remnants of the imprint of their soul. It can be very powerful and resilient. It might not even fully dissipate after centuries or even a millennium. But when Beyonder characteristics form a mystical item with their surrounding objects, there's a need to have a sufficiently similar soul in order to use them, otherwise, the negative effects will be extraordinary. And when such Beyonder characteristics are preserved and made into the main ingredient of a potion, the consumer similarly must have a powerful soul body to withstand it, otherwise, there's a high chance of failure. In mysticism, an advancement's failure will often lead to a loss of control or death. Only very few lucky ones can be calmed down and maintain an intricate balance. However, it's rumored that certain special sealed artifacts can draw out unfused Beyonder characteristics and recondense them. It would be akin to not having consumed the potion, so the failures will only suffer a storm-like assault on their soul. But according to my conjectures, there's likely some level of mutation at the gene level. This is because, based on the information provided, those who failed their advancement and survived by this method had mostly died from terminal illnesses within 5 years. Therefore, consuming a potion similar to one's soul body can effectively decrease the difficulty of advancements, but it will leave behind remnant soul imprints. Unknowingly, one will suffer an identity dissociation, and they would slowly transform into a monster stitched at the soul level. It's just like that high-sequence Beyonder who resurrected on his body. Resurrected. On careful thought, it's really quite terrifying. However, the church told me that there are roughly 3 methods to rid the high-sequence Beyonder soul imprints in a Beyonder characteristic. As for what they are, they didn't tell me. They don't seem simple. It's no wonder the Sauron family enjoys calling descendants who look similar to their ancestors as having talent. Talent. I have to say that I do pity Florin quite a bit. Monsters stitched at the soul level. High-sequence Beyonder soul imprints. Sounds a little alarming. So high-sequence Beyonder potions have such a problem. The churches probably have a way to resolve them. They have no lack of angels and grade 0 sealed artifacts. They can shatter a Beyonder characteristic and recondense them, thus obtaining a purified one. Those ancient families probably aren't that lucky. They might not have any more angels protecting them. They might only have 1 or 2 grade 0 sealed artifacts, but they aren't that easily used. Furthermore, different grade 0 sealed artifacts have different uses. They might not be adequate for such matters. Klein's mind raced as he made the diary pages in his hand vanish. Then, he looked at Miss Justice and asked with a chuckle, "What do you wish to exchange them for?" Audrey was waiting for her potion ingredients, and she temporarily had nothing she lacked. Therefore, without any hesitation, she chose to satisfy her curiosity. "Honorable Mr. Fool, is that an additional card by your hand, a card of blasphemy? Which one is it?" You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.